Hey, I have an announcement to make. I'm making a series of videos on Palestine and Israel. But before I can get started with that, I need to make this video right here to deal with a pressing drama issue that is very related to that subject. I promise this video is still going to be quite informative, as I'm incapable of not going into far more depth than needed. So this video will also go into a lot of detail about Israel and Palestine, and especially about the ideology of liberal Zionism, which I'm going to be dissecting throughout. For your convenience, there's going to be timestamps so that you can avoid the pure drama part if you're not interested. After this, we'll be back to our regularly scheduled programming of entirely too long video essays, and hopefully I won't ever need to make a video like this one ever again. Anyway, this is your last chance to stop watching before the video starts if you don't care about drama. I warned you.
Have you considered calling him anti-Semitic? Feels like he supports the Holocaust.
In October last year, I was linked a very poor political argument that another creator who I'd previously never heard of made on their stream. So I watched it on my own stream, responded to it, and uploaded the clip to my second channel in a compilation video where I also responded to someone else on that same topic. Little did I know at the time that this would start a chain of events which would lead to me being defamed for 8 months straight as an anti-Semite, alongside a whole lot of other nasty stuff. Here's the clip I was responding to from Eristocracy, the creator in question. Note that the original VOD is unfortunately lost, so I've reconstructed it by cutting out my own reactions to it. That's why there's some cuts. It has not been misleadingly edited in any way. Everything said is still in the exact same order as it was originally.
I think there are a lot of things about Canada that most people take for granted. And I think in general, lefties on Twitter and all of that kind of stuff, I think that they have like a bias of only focusing on the negative stuff. And those negative things are important, but they're not putting them in the right perspective. Right? Like they're not putting it in the context. And their context is usually their lens is very narrow. They're thinking Canada, Indigenous, right? And my lens is a little larger. Like, you are too online, like the online left. But yeah, like, my lens is a lot larger. Like, I have different perspectives. I mean, I'll give you an example. Is in Canada, it's kind of just a given that if you don't listen to the police, they're not going to shoot you. Where I come from in South Africa, if you don't listen to the police, they might shoot you or they might rape you. In Canada, I don't have to have bars on my windows. In South Africa, I do. In Canada, I get to live alongside people of different cultures and different languages and different groups, and we all literally get along. It doesn't mean there are not problems. There are definitely problems, but we can literally interact on the street, feel safe with one another, and communicate. It is not that way in the countries I came from. In Canada, the rape rate for women is a lot lower than 50%. Where I come from, 50% of all women are raped. In Canada, I'm not forced to go to the army. In Canada, I'm not forced to go to the army and fight in a war that I don't believe in. I'm allowed to get a divorce without my husband's permission. Most people in Canada, not all people and not a lot of Indigenous people, but most people have access to clean water. There are a lot of really positive things about living in Canada, especially for those who are immigrants.
For some extra context, this was in regards to the mass graves of Indigenous children that very recently before this had been discovered in Canada, which had lots of people talking about Indigenous issues there. I think that why that clip is dumb would probably be pretty self-explanatory for the average viewer of my channel, who by now probably at least knows a thing or two about colonialism. But I'm gonna explain it in far too much depth anyway. She was reacting to discussion about Indigenous issues, including genocide in Canada, by implying that they're talked about too much, and proceeding to talk about how great Canada is for her as a non-Indigenous person who moved there. Canada is a country that was conquered from its Indigenous people with a new society, the one that she's praising in that clip, built on the ruins of theirs at their expense. So to imply that people talk too much about the plight of the still incredibly marginalized Indigenous people of Canada, and not enough about how great Canada is for people like her, is just really dumb and out of touch at best, and malicious at worst, especially given that even the Canadian state itself has acknowledged that it committed genocide against Indigenous people. It's exactly the same as, say, complaining that people talk too much about the oppression of black people descended from slaves in the USA, because the USA works fine for you as someone who isn't from that group, who benefits from the society that their ancestors were forced to build. It's ignoring that what's been done to them, and that what's still being done to them, is a part of what has made it good for you and others like you. It's comical to frame yourself as having a wider lens and a broader perspective, and as being the one who's bringing nuance, when what you're saying really amounts to little more than, people talking about my country's origins and its continued crimes makes me uncomfortable. Because it works fine for me. Me. Talk about me. That's the exact opposite of having a wider lens. It's the exact opposite of bringing nuance. It's ignoring the wider context and history to focus purely on how things are for you and others like you who enjoy the fruits of being an accepted, mainstream part of a society built on the ruins of others. It's the same sort of brainless, defensive reaction you get from American conservatives whenever systemic racism is discussed. All lives matter sort of stuff. She even mentioned that she knows that none of this actually applies to Indigenous people, yet she nonetheless apparently just couldn't resist going on like this in response to people talking about Indigenous issues. It's also especially dumb given the fact that, as she notes in the clip, she previously lived in South Africa, a country well known as a pretty good place to live for white people or foreigners from rich countries like Israel, where she's noted that she was from before moving there. The sorts of problems she went over there are what black South Africans deal with, not relatively well-off immigrants. Those black South Africans are in fact analogous to the Indigenous people of Canada, not to her. For Indigenous people, living under the Canadian state is a lot more of a nightmare than a privilege. Everything she listed there that's good for her is not at all good for them. So to bring it up in response to people discussing Indigenous issues is, bad. All in all, the clip was an excellent example of someone just being completely blind to the systems that benefit them at the cost of others. And God, who the hell watches this, honestly? How do people like this get viewers? You could talk to any random person in Canada, the USA, or Australia about Indigenous issues, and they'd probably give you a similar sort of ignorant, poorly articulated, defensive response. It's just so stupid. Boring, uninsightful, generic, simplistic, every negative adjective you could imagine. And that's pretty much the gist of what I said in my short response to her, though in a much less organized way given that it was an unprepared stream reaction. I then uploaded it as a clip to my second channel. Here's a bit of it where I basically sum up everything that I just said. She thinks that she has some sort of like special larger perspective and that she's enlightening her viewers because she's just glossing over everything regarding the fucking genocide here to talk about how great things are for the people who have benefited from it. It's so absurd. She thinks that she's injecting nuance here. No one who thinks they're injecting nuance is ever actually injecting nuance. Very soon following this, Eristocracy started incessantly trying to spread the notion that I'm anti-Semitic, though she lacks any real evidence for that, so she's stuck to making that claim without actually providing any. And this has been widely accepted by her audience, as well as those of the bigger creators who've been aiding her, none of whom need to actually see any evidence for anything before they believe it. She's also, quite literally, accused me of being a rapist facing actual charges for the crime, of course while saying it could just be a rumor to absolve herself of any blame for intentionally and maliciously spreading heinous bullshit to damage someone else's reputation. So yeah, this is pretty serious. Now obviously, this is just incredibly stupid and she knows it. According to the story that she tells about herself, she's migrated to at least 2 different countries, so she absolutely knows that you need to prove that you have a clean criminal record in each of your previous countries of residence to be granted a visa pretty much anywhere in the world, a process that I've personally gone through in Argentina like 4 or 5 times at this point. So the only options here are that the story that she's concocted about herself is false and she didn't know this, or she does know it and she's just intentionally spreading horrible lies that she knows to be false. Both possibilities show her to be an incredibly dishonest person. I've heard rumors that you escaped to Canada to avoid trial for feces eating charges, Aristocracy, but I have no clue if it's true. Throughout all of this, I've done my best to stick to attacking her for her political views and arguments, regardless of how much she's crossed that line against me. The most personal that I've gotten is making jabs at her for being from South Africa, which is completely acceptable and valid because I've never met a nice South African! Just like it's completely acceptable and valid to make fun of me for my defect of being Australian. Yet she's consistently stuck with these baseless, defamatory allegations that she's been steadily escalating, to the point that she's started multiple campaigns to have people mass report my YouTube and Twitch in an effort to get me banned. So unfortunately, I need to taint my main channel with a bit of a drama video. I'm really sorry about this, but I have little other recourse to get the truth out there. So yeah, I'm being defamed by an anonymous anime avatar streamer, which is just a completely ridiculous sentence. I really wouldn't care about this at all if it wasn't for the much bigger creators who have accepted and spread her narrative without even checking the evidence. We'll be talking about them later. Because of them, I'd guess that at least tens of thousands of people are now convinced that her allegations are true, possibly even more. This is a symptom of how this supposed politics space on YouTube and Twitch works. Creators and their viewers actually care very little about politics. At the very best, it's more of a secondary theme. It's all much more a vehicle for high school clique interpersonal drama sort of stuff, so they'll gladly run cover for someone who has terrible politics that their purported principles would dictate they should be wholly against, provided that in doing so, they can get back at someone they dislike in the process. I'm going to explain further here by going over the rest of the story, and just completely dismantling this person's entire political ideology in the process. After I posted that first clip, Aristocracy's response was mostly just to claim that she's not white, but Central Asian, and therefore apparently all of my criticisms were automatically invalid. Personally, I already think that appealing to identity to avoid dealing with completely valid arguments against your political views is pretty bad form. And it's even worse when you're completely anonymous and have the luxury of potentially just inventing whatever you want about yourself whenever convenient. I'm personally not really into just blindly accepting whatever anonymous accounts on the internet say about themselves when they're backed into a corner in an argument. Anonymity gives you the privilege of being able to say you're whoever you want to. And if you're petty enough, you might just make something up to try and score a cheap win in an argument. And I think it's pretty clear that she is definitely that petty. But her identity is really just completely irrelevant regardless, because her bringing it up is just obviously fallacious. Her argument was just incredibly dumb, whether she's a white immigrant to Canada or a Mongolian, Jewish, Israeli, South African one, as she claims to be. The other person who I critiqued in that video was Dr. Heem, a POC immigrant to Canada, and he was saying very similar things to Aristocracy, so it just changes nothing. At best, she said, people talk too much about how bad things are for Indigenous people. They should talk more about how good their genocide has been for non-Indigenous people, such as middle-class immigrants like me, rather than such as white people like me. So I responded to her response, basically just saying that, and then didn't talk about her for another couple of weeks. Then, someone in my stream chat linked me a reaction video from her YouTube channel where she critiques a video from Vox on the history of Israel and Palestine. So we watched it. I went into that video not really knowing what to expect since I knew nothing about her wider politics beyond that one exchange weeks earlier, but I was genuinely shocked by what I ended up hearing. My assumption was that she was just kind of a typical centrist or apolitical type person who was just exhibiting the generic defensive reaction that you expect from people from countries like Canada, Australia, or the US when they're confronted with Indigenous issues. Dismissiveness, discomfort, you know, all that sort of stuff. There was nothing really special or weird about that, aside from the fact that despite having such a completely uninteresting perspective and less charisma than even me somehow, she nonetheless had a stream with a couple hundred viewers and was being held up as a bastion of logic and reason by several large, supposedly left-wing streamers. Oh boy, was I wrong. She's a lot worse. She's a straight-up Israeli ethnonationalist. Someone who thinks that ethno-states, meaning states that aim to maintain a certain ethnicity as at least the majority of their population as a matter of intentional policy, are valid, and that Israel should be one and should exclude Palestinians to that end. Okay, so I need to give you guys a bit of a short background on Israel and Palestine to give us some context before continuing. I'll be going much deeper into this in a future video, but for now, this'll do. Israel is a country that is the result of a settler colonial project known as Zionism. Since the 19th century, Zionists have campaigned for the mass migration of people who they consider to be ethnic Jews to Palestine, with the aim of eventually taking over the country for themselves. At best, they ignored in their plans the fact that it was already inhabited, and at worst, they openly called for the expulsion of the non-Jewish people who live there, as the father of Zionism, Theodor Herzl, once did. In summary, they were inspired by previous settler colonial projects such as the US and Canada, and wanted to do the same sort of thing themselves. After many decades of massive lobbying campaigns, these recent migrants, still a small minority of the population of Palestine, eventually convinced the UN to rubber stamp the splitting of Palestine into two countries, one of which was to be a Jewish ethno-state, without any consent or approval from the hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who live there. During and following the brief conflict that resulted, Israelis stole themselves a country and ethnically cleansed most of it of Palestinians, fulfilling Herzl's wish. Since then, Israel has been oppressing Palestinians every second of every day, both in and outside of the illegitimate country of Israel, trying to conquer and settle as much of their remaining land as possible. It's done everything it can to solidify its status as a Jewish supremacist ethno-state, with a demographic majority made up of those it considers ethnically Jewish. Jews from all over the world who have never stepped foot in the Middle East are invited to migrate and receive automatic citizenship with massive state support purely on the basis of their ethnicity, while the Palestinian refugees whose land and homes they occupy are not only denied sovereignty over their own country, but prevented from ever returning. 1/3 of the descendants of these ethnically cleansed Palestinians still live in temporary refugee camps, and they get to watch videos of their family homes being handed over to random guys from New York who the Israelis decide to be of the correct race.
You are stealing my house.
And if I don't steal it, someone else is gonna steal it.
No.
Other Palestinians live in deplorable conditions in the Gaza Strip, which is essentially a massive concentration camp, or the West Bank, a nominally Palestinian region which is in fact occupied and administered by Israel and under a constant state of siege by Israeli troops. The rest live in Israel itself, where they're second-class citizens that the state has been actively trying to erase as an identifiable group since its beginning, through what they literally call the Judaization of Palestinian majority areas. Israel is a modern version of settler colonialism, at a similar stage of the process to what the USA and Canada were in the 19th century. They engaged in conquest followed by mass removals of the previous populations, the attempted destruction of their societies, and their concentration into specific areas, usually known as reservations, where they could be controlled and kept destitute by the colonists who destroyed their homeland and built their own on the ruins. It is a clear racial supremacist state from top to bottom. It always has been and always will be for as long as it exists. Ethnic supremacy is what makes Israel Israel. It's what it's based on. It's what it's always been based on. It's an indefensible ethno-state. Simple as that. This is obviously something that anyone remotely to the left, or even just anyone anywhere on the political spectrum at all, who has even a slight interest in important facets of basic morality like justice, should be against. Our siding with the Palestinian cause should be unequivocal. There's no nuance here, there's no both sides, there's no bigger lens, there's no what about. Israel is a country based entirely around ethnic supremacy, conquest, and exclusion. And it's only gotten worse and worse as Palestinians continue to resist and refuse to allow themselves to be erased. It must be completely opposed. And anyone who can't bring themselves to oppose it and denounce the existence of a country like this in the strongest possible terms is, at very best, a tacit supporter of genocidal settler colonialism in the name of racial supremacy. Now, with the background out of the way, I'm going to go over the worst parts of the Aristocracy video in question that shocked me so much, and respond to them in detail. I have not edited anything in these clips aside from breaking them down into short illustrative highlights. In them, she talks for periods of between 17 to 50 seconds straight, finishing multiple sentences, which is more than enough time for someone to accurately summarize their views on something. Certainly, if someone clipped me speaking about an issue non-stop for 40 seconds straight, I'm sure it would be a decently accurate summary of my views unless I was joking, which she wasn't here. She clearly signals that these are her own opinions multiple times, using qualifiers like I think and to me. If you doubt this, I encourage you to check out her original video, which will be linked in the description. I'll be pointing directly to the timestamps for each of these clips so that you can verify them yourself. There is no mitigating context here, and I have nothing to hide. If you don't get why I put in such a long preemptive disclaimer, it's because she, her fans, and certain other big streamers have been outright denying that she said any of this, despite the evidence being clearly available, literally publicly on her own channel. The audacity, right? I'll be going over this denial too after this segment. Okay, so let's get started with the clips and dissecting them.
We'd all love to get to an area where, ethnicity, religion, and all that stuff matters very little. But to me, it's kind of crazy to expect people to be like, well, you guys have to accept everyone, and then watch that majority population turn it into an Arab pan state where Jews become second-class citizens. Saying, okay, like, you guys should just have to deal with that, right? You could just have to take the hit so you have the moral headway. It makes sense in a world where there are tons of ethnic and national and religious states, right? To at least have one for your own where you're safe, at least for just one country. And I think that that's totally valid.
There, she clearly said that she sees the idea of an ethno-state, and specifically Israel, since that's the one she was talking about here, as totally valid. She says verbatim, I think that's totally valid. And a couple sentences earlier, she said to me. So she unambiguously stated that she personally thinks it's valid for Israel to be a Jewish ethno-state, in her own opinion, in a paragraph-long oration. She also echoed concerns there that sound exactly like the Great Replacement conspiracy theory, which we all unfortunately know all about due to various mass shootings that have been motivated by it. This theory is based around fears that the white population of certain countries is at risk of becoming a minority, and that this is a bad thing that white people should be concerned about. Similarly to that, she clearly expressed the idea that it's crazy to think that Israel shouldn't continue to exist as an ethno-state with a majority ethnic Jewish population, because otherwise Jews would become second-class citizens, instead of, the Palestinians who are second-class citizens now. To really drive that home, let's change just literally 2 words around and see how it sounds. To me, it's kind of crazy to expect people to be like, well, you guys have to accept everyone, and then watch that majority population turn it into a multicultural state where whites become second-class citizens. That's straight out of a mass shooter's manifesto. A core facet of the Great Replacement idea is the white genocide conspiracy theory, which holds that white people not being a demographic majority would constitute a genocide because they'd supposedly go from being dominant to being oppressed. This is just complete projection. It's people who come from groups that have historically oppressed other groups in their society, asserting that the same would be done to them in order to justify their continued domination of those other groups. And it's the same in this case. Aristocracy justifies Israel remaining an ethno-state with the fear that Jews would become second-class citizens. Just like how Palestinians are right now. Palestinians can't have their land and homes back because they might do to us what we're doing to them. Literally exactly the same sort of projection. So in summary, Israelis should not only keep the land that they ethnically cleansed and occupied, but Palestinians also shouldn't even be allowed to move back into the neighborhoods they were expelled from and live alongside us. Now look, any animosity towards Israel among Palestinians is caused by Israel itself. Obviously, they are the oppressor. They cause the problem and they have all the power here. Once they stop oppressing Palestinians, any such hatred will begin to dissipate, and obviously the 2 populations would be able to live alongside each other just fine eventually. It's on Israel to do that though, not the Palestinians. The only way that you could think otherwise is if you believe the idea commonly spread by Israeli ethno-nationalists, that Palestinians are simply immutably mindless beasts who cannot be trusted, rather than people simply reacting to their oppression at Israel's hands. Funnily enough, these same talking points were espoused by a very similar group of people historically, white nationalist South Africans, who constantly said that giving black people equal rights would result in a genocide against them because apparently they just wouldn't be able to help themselves. She's channeling both Boer neo-Nazis and Tucker Carlson. Oh, and speaking of Tucker, he's actually cited this exact talking point about the importance of Israel maintaining a demographic majority of Jews to justify his idea that the USA should maintain a demographic majority of whites. He basically made the point that if it's okay for Israel to say that, why can't he say it about the US and white people?
You wonder if people even debate questions like this in countries that don't hate themselves, countries like Japan or South Korea or Israel. Go to the Anti-Defamation League's website sometime if you'd like a glimpse of what an unvarnished conversation about a country's national interest might look like. In a short essay posted to the site, the ADL explains why the state of Israel should not allow more Arabs to become citizens with voting rights. Quote, with historically high birth rates among the Palestinians and a possible influx of Palestinian refugees and their descendants now living around the world, the ADL explains, Jews would quickly become a minority within a binational state, thus likely ending any semblance of equal representation and protections. In this situation, the Jewish population would be increasingly politically and potentially physically vulnerable. It is unrealistic and unacceptable, the ADL continues, to expect the state of Israel to voluntarily subvert its own sovereign existence and nationalist identity and become a vulnerable minority within what was once its own territory, end quote. Now, from Israel's perspective, this makes perfect sense. Why would any democratic nation make its own citizens less powerful? Isn't that the deepest betrayal of all? In the words of the ADL, why would a government subvert its own sovereign existence? Good question. Maybe ADL President Jonathan Greenblatt will join us sometime to explain and tell us whether that same principle applies to the United States. Most Americans believe it does.
And you know what? He actually has a point there, though not in the way he thinks. Why should one of those be acceptable but the other not? And the answer is that, well, they're both completely unacceptable. The complete opposite to what he was implying, which is that they should both be acceptable. Aristocracy's additional justification there, that there are tons of ethno-states, is also just wrong. There are actually very few countries in the world that are either officially or unofficially trying to maintain a demographic majority of a certain ethnicity. Most countries are multi-ethnic. They might have ethnic majorities, sure, but they're not consciously trying to maintain them or anything. And they certainly don't have laws and stuff mandating it as Israel does. And most ethnicities in the world do not actually have a state that's just for them. Should Kurds or Sikhs or any of hundreds of other ethnic groups invade Israel and claim it for themselves, since they don't have their own state? Would she accept that as valid? Obviously not, because it's a post hoc justification for the Israeli ethno-state, not a consistent political principle. Okay, clip 2 now.
You do a population exchange, it's very hard to reverse the change because you basically just recreate the problem even worse when you try to reverse it. And this is one of the problems with the Palestinians having the right to return, because they want to take up space, they want to come return, and they're a much larger population now.
So there she complains that Palestinians, ethnically cleansed from their homeland, want to take up space. Don't you just hate it when the people you ethnically cleanse want to come back to take up your space? Honestly, you couldn't have worded that any worse if you tried. This is Nazi-like rhetoric. I've gone over this in detail in my video on how the USA inspired the Nazis, so if you want a more in-depth explanation, I suggest you go check out that video at this timestamp. But a quick summary is that the idea of Lebensraum was core to Nazi ideology. This dictated that different races of people were in an endless kill or be killed contest for living space. For the supposedly Aryan Germans to survive, each family needed not just a house, but also lots of open space. And the only way for them to get that space was at the expense of other races. Sound familiar? Yeah, it's the same thing. And it will sound even more familiar as we go over the other things she said that sound very much like that. The narrative here is that people of the wrong ethnicity can't be allowed to take up space that could be used by Israeli Jews, many of whom are literally living in houses or on land that was systemically stolen from Palestinians within living memory. Now, there is obviously enough space in Palestine for everyone, Palestinians and Israelis alike. If all of the roughly 20 million Israelis and Palestinians in the world move there, it would have a population density of about 700 per square kilometer. And note that this is also highly exaggerated, as many Palestinian refugees who've since settled elsewhere would not actually want to come back and live permanently. So it would probably be more like 500 to 600 per square kilometer. This is relatively high globally, but it's still perfectly fine unless you think the only possible way that people can live is in like a suburban McMansion. There's plenty of far denser places in the world. The city that I live in, Buenos Aires, has for example a population density of 13,000 per square kilometer, which is nearly 40 times higher than that of Israel right now. The metropolitan area of Buenos Aires, which includes a ton of suburban housing, farmland, and very open spaces, has a density of more than 3,000 people per square kilometer. Help me, I need more living space. There's no room. They can't come here. Even the state of New Jersey has a higher population density than Israel, and it still has endless rows of these incredibly inefficient, car-centric suburban areas that we'd all be better off without. Palestine clearly does have more than enough room for everyone, and that it would be a bit denser than most other countries overall is no justification to keep Palestinians out of their own homeland. And even Israel itself clearly doesn't even remotely think that it has no room, or it wouldn't be inviting random Jews from all around the world to come over, get immediate citizenship, and join in on their colonialism. Palestinians can't return, but Braden from New York can. Give me a break. If you want to see overly dense, look at the Gaza concentration camp, not the rich, coddled population in the settler colonial occupation known as Israel. The idea that ethnically cleansed Palestinians can't return because the people who stole their country would maybe be a bit inconvenienced by having more of them around is just messed up. And I honestly just can't believe that anyone could watch someone say that and not realize this themselves. It's so transparently just a justification that she came up with in the spur of the moment as a roundabout way to argue against Palestinians returning and diluting the racial majority that she wants to protect. It straight up reminds me of the favourite phrase of Australian racists, "Fuck off, we're full." And anyway, if we were to accept her argument that there's not enough space, then obviously the people who should get priority to take up the limited space are the ethnically cleansed Palestinians, not Israel, the country that ethnically cleansed them, stole their land and homes, murdered their families, their friends, their children, and which has done everything possible to try and make their lives horrible since. There are hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who literally still have the keys to their stolen houses even. Many of them still have the deeds. The notion that people who conquered and settled other people's land in living memory, who destroyed their country, should get to retain it all for themselves is obviously an incredibly problematic one. It de facto legitimizes the notion that might makes right. It would mean that if you commit war crimes by implanting settlers into conquered territory, it is thereafter morally wrong for it to ever be taken back. So, for example, all that Russia would need to do to legitimize further annexations of Ukrainian territory would be to implant settlers from Russia, wait a bit, and then voila, it's now wrong for Ukraine to ever take it back. Does that sound right to you? No? Then it's not right in Israel either. Also, in this case, I just want to note that we're not even talking about expelling anyone from the country proper or taking all the land back. Just giving stolen homes and land back to people who can reasonably prove their families were expelled. To deny the Palestinian people this basic right, one literally enshrined in international law and UN resolutions, is downright ghoulish. There is more than enough space for everyone in Palestine, so nothing resembling the expulsion of the colonizer population is even worth contemplating. It's a pure hypothetical hatched by Zionists to justify ethnonationalism. Their equivalent, as I went over earlier, of the white genocide conspiracy theory. However, if somehow it did come to war, and I use that term very loosely because the fact of the matter is, Israel is and always has been engaging in a completely one-sided war against the Palestinian population, so this would merely be them fighting back, then the Palestinians would obviously be in the moral right to fight to retake a country which was conquered from them and which they were expelled from just 74 years ago. Expecting them not to even try to resist, not to fight back, to just lay down, be oppressed, and let Israel occupy their homes until the end of time. Now that's immoral. Palestinians are the only people in the world who are so consistently painted as evil for merely existing that they're even denounced just for hypothetically fighting to reclaim their own country from a state that has done its best to attempt to destroy them since its inception. In no other situation would so many people do so much mental gymnastics to argue against an oppressed people's simple right to resist. It is an obvious attempt to invert the reality of who is the oppressed and who is the oppressor in service of delegitimizing the Palestinian cause and legitimizing the genocidal state of Israel. Zionists love to claim anti-Semitism to defend Israel, but the reality is that anti-Palestinianism is infinitely more endemic in regards to this so-called conflict. And it's also just totally accepted, almost everywhere in the first world at least. Advocating to keep people systemically cleansed from their own homeland within living memory out of it, in the name of maintaining an ethnic majority, is pretty clearly fucked up. The aim here is certainly not to protect any state's ethnic majority or even existence. It's to get both populations living aside one another in the same state in peace. Okay, next clip.
I don't think Palestinians can ever get the right of return. Because as the Vox mentioned, there's over 7 million. Those 700,000 have now become 7 million in terms of their descendants. I don't think there's no room. They can't come there and Israel still remain a majority state. So the only solution to me is, if you think that Israel is the cause of the refugee problem, are financial reparations. And Israel does not actually have as much money as a lot of people think.
That's more the same sentiment that she expressed in the previous clip, except this time it's even more explicit. There's no room. They can't come here because it would mean Israel would no longer be a majority Jewish state. Wow, she really just said it. There is clearly room in Palestine for Palestinians, and it's not really about that at all for her anyway. It's all about maintaining the majority ethno-state. For a bit of context here, the right of return, which is what we've already been talking about, is the right for ethnically cleansed Palestinians to return to their homes, their land, or at the very least their homeland, which has been a core demand of the Palestinian resistance since the very beginning and still is today. Her idea of reparations in place of the right of return is just paying people who were genocided with a new country built on top of the ruins of theirs to fuck off. You can't just buy a people out of their homeland, out of their homes, and especially not when there's millions and millions of them right there waiting to return who would never accept that. And it's especially awful because even liberal international law has recognized the right of return forever, since the UN passed Resolution 194 in 1948. It clearly states that refugees must be able to return to their homes and that compensation is only valid in the event that they don't want to or for property damage. Buying them off is not an option. And among the ethnically cleansed Palestinians themselves, the consensus is overwhelming. Polls show that the vast majority would not accept compensation in place of the return of their property, and that they would not accept a peace agreement that did not allow the right of return. So no one who is against the right of return could ever be considered as anything but an enemy of the Palestinian cause, since it's such a fundamental part of it, and especially not someone who frames their opposition in such a dishonest and gross way, like, they want to take up space and make us an ethnic minority. The talking points that aristocracy used to advocate against the right of return here are pretty common ones used by right-wing Zionist organizations. For one particularly egregious example, both of them were included in a dystopian 2009 guidebook to manipulating public opinion written by the Israel Project, a US-based neoconservative pro-Israel organization. Regarding the Palestinian right of return, they said, "We cannot accept this phrase. We cannot allow it to enter the opinion leader lexicon." They then go on to state that, at most, a case could be made that those who actually had homes within Israeli boundaries might be entitled to some compensation, and that pro-Israel arguments should appeal to anti-immigrant sentiment by framing the right of return not as return, but as mass Palestinian immigration that would dilute the Jewish majority. Aristocracy used both of these talking points to the letter. She has pretty much the exact same opinions on these incredibly important issues to Palestinian liberation as much of the pro-Israel lobby does, and that should ring alarm bells for anyone who was misled into thinking that she was ever anything resembling a pro-Palestinian voice. And yes, though it's a minor aside, Israel does have a lot of money. By GDP per capita, it is the 35th richest country in the world, and is significantly richer than countries like Spain and South Korea. On top of that, it receives copious amounts of funding from the USA, the EU, etc. Not only is she justifying Israeli ethnonationalism, but the random facts that she's pulling out to try and back it up are just plain wrong too. Each of them is being used to paint the picture that Israel is far weaker, far poorer, and far worse off than it actually is. It's all lies. Israel is extremely well off, and it is certainly not weak at all, and especially not compared to the Palestinians that it oppresses. Okay, second to last clip now.
It's a hard place to live, especially when compared to other Western countries. It's very expensive, and there's very little space. The idea of like a 3-bedroom house, you don't get that shit in Israel. You do not get a 3-bedroom house in Israel. That is something that is only allowed for the rich, the very, very rich. In Israel, the most you will get is a shitty apartment. Everyone lives in shitty apartments, okay? So the only place you're going to get a house, if you want a house and you want your kids to be able to have green space and be able to run, is in the settlements.
In this part, she seems to imply that she sympathizes with Israelis who go and steal some of the tiny bit of Palestinian land that's still left, because again, there's very little space. That is a favorite of hers, Jesus. So the people who are already occupying Palestinian land need to go and steal even more of it because they want green space. Somehow, the already massively oppressed Palestinians who they're stealing this land from don't even merit a mention. It's the poor settlers wanting a slight increase to their living standards who we need to empathize with. Justifying even more settler colonialism with high housing costs is just ghoulish, honestly. I don't even know how else to describe it. Nazi settlers also moved into Polish houses to increase their living standards. Is that a valid justification? Obviously not, and even bringing it up is incredibly questionable. Look, I know this is going to be a really controversial take, so please don't cancel me for it, but if you have to choose between living in a 2-bedroom house or stealing even more land from Palestinians in the West Bank to build a 3-bedroom on, you should just live in the 2-bedroom. I'd like a bigger house too, but you don't see me getting IDF goons to come in and appropriate me one from downtrodden and oppressed people, or to ethnically cleanse another Palestinian village so that I can build a new one in an illegal settlement. Basically, these settlers are awful, and no one should imply that they deserve an ounce of sympathy at all, and especially not just because they want space to run around in. Sorry, Palestinian family, I know you've lived here your entire lives and your ancestors lived here for hundreds of years before you, but my kids need a lawn, so make way. The idea that 3-bedroom dwellings are only for very, very rich people is also just massively wrong anyway. Even aside from the ridiculousness of that idea being used to garner sympathy for people stealing even more of what little land there is that's still owned by Palestinians. If Israelis want a bigger home, they have many options aside from that. The average Israeli family earns $4,000 a month. In reality, this is much higher for Israeli Jews, as the figure is brought down by Palestinians living in Israel, who make up the vast majority of the country's poor. Their average incomes are nearly half those of Israeli Jews, thanks to the internal apartheid system. But still, even if we use that greatly skewed $4,000 a month figure as a guideline, it took me 3 seconds to find 3-bedroom homes that an average Israeli family could easily afford to live in, such as this 3-bedroom rental in Haifa for $900 a month, or this other 3-bedroom for $1,000 a month, or even the $1,300 a month for this 4-bedroom. Clearly, 3-bedroom homes are not even remotely the sole domain of the very, very rich. Israel is a rich country, and like in pretty much every other rich country in the world, outright buying a home there is relatively expensive, but every other rich country has that exact same problem with their housing market. It's hardly an excuse to go and do even more colonization. I mean, you don't often see people in other developed countries nowadays saying, "Damn, housing prices are a bit high. Our only option is to go and do some settler colonialism." I hate so much that I feel like any of this even needs to be said. It should be completely obvious. But Israel supporters are so deranged, and fans of people like Aristocracy are just so abominably stupid, that this for some godforsaken reason needs to be said. High housing prices are also hardly proof that it's very hard to live in Israel, as she claimed. By that measure, it would also be very hard to live in every developed country in the world. And since such a statement would only really make sense if it's a relative one, yeah, I think not. Look, if living in Israel is hard to you, you do not know what hard is. You are probably the most coddled person in the entire world. You'd probably die of a heart attack if you had to walk through a neighborhood outside of the world's richest countries. And certainly through one in the West Bank or Gaza. Israel is another generic, rich, westernized consumer country with a very high average standard of living, at least if you're lucky enough that the state's race science declares you to be Jewish. And that high standard of living is built on the race-based dispossession and oppression of millions of people that it still directly terrorizes every single day. The reason why Israel builds settlements in Palestinian holdout territories is not because there's not more room to build towns, cities, and housing in Israel. There is. That's why they actually build new towns all over Israel proper all the time, which, by the way, only Jews are allowed to move into. It's also not because settlers couldn't raise their living standards by moving elsewhere in Israel instead. They could and they do. It's all just a part of Israel's continued colonization of Palestine. It's about stealing even more land, increasing their national territory, and driving Palestinians further into misery. And even ignoring all that about the facts being wrong, using them in this way would be stupid regardless. The notion that you can't come back to the land you were ethnically cleansed from because housing prices there are too high for the people who ethnically cleansed you is just absurd on the face of it. It's a way to completely shift the subject of the discussion, away from it being a simple question of material justice which has a very obvious answer. The question of, should families systemically ethnically cleansed from their homeland in living memory be able to return, is something that no one could answer no to without making themselves look awful. And they know that. So it's changed to, can families systemically ethnically cleansed from their homeland return without causing any minor inconvenience to those who ethnically cleanse them? And suddenly, we're no longer arguing about the direct question of whether Palestinians should be allowed to return to Palestine, but instead about the completely arbitrary prerequisite of whether it can be done without impeding the divine right of Israelis to have at least 3 bedrooms worth of Lebensraum. That's the game being played here. Very simple questions with very clear answers are abstracted as much as possible, and thus concern is shifted away from the oppressed to those who benefit from their oppression. This sort of tactic is very common in the defense of Israel, and you can also see it in other similar instances. It's pure bullshit and invalid in so many ways, a thrown together post hoc justification for the real goal that she states multiple times throughout the video, maintaining the ethnic majority of the stolen, racial supremacist state of Israel. She also seems unable to even fathom the idea that people don't actually need to live in suburban houses with massive yards and their own green space, and that those types of dwellings are actually an awful drain on society as a whole. None of it adds up. It's like she put her hand into a hat marked colonial ethnonationalism justifications and drew all the options that sound like a passage out of Mein Kampf. Okay, last clip.
And this is why I get really scared that Israel is going to become an apartheid state. And all those lefties are going to turn out to be right when they criticize Israel, calling it apartheid. Because if they keep building the settlement and more settlements happen, it's going to be more and larger of a human rights disaster to pull out and to get rid of the Jews from the region and give them back to the Palestinians. So it means that the only solution you're going to have is a one-state solution where everything becomes an Israeli state. The big problem with that is that for Israel to continue to exist as Israel and not just, become a non-Jewish state, and that's just a typical Arab country in the Middle East with an Arab majority population, Israel, and to remain with Western values and all those things, Jews need to remain the majority of the population.
Yeah, I saved the worst for last. There's a lot to unpack here. In the first sentence, she immediately claims that she is scared that Israel is going to become an apartheid state, meaning that she thinks it's not one yet, a position that she's reiterated multiple times since. She even denigrates the idea by calling it just an analogy rather than a reality that's lived by millions of people. This is someone who's routinely tried to paint herself as some sort of reasoned voice on Palestine and as a friend of Palestinians. I know that's probably weird to hear given everything we've gone over up until this point. Yet she can't even acknowledge the very basics of their oppression. Apartheid is, if anything, a pretty reductive way to describe the Palestinian situation. It is apartheid, but it's also worse than just that. Apartheid is one facet of a broader system of colonialism. So if someone can't even acknowledge that, any remotely decent person should probably consider them a piece of shit running cover for an open and proud racist occupation, imposing a racial supremacist regime on the people it stole its country from. The same people who run cover for her constantly have sworn off dozens of other people for far less. I'll be going far deeper into apartheid in just a minute, just to drive this point home. What comes after that is even worse though. She's not worried about the settlements for a reason that would make sense, like, the fact that they're settler colonists who are stealing even more of Palestine in the name of racial supremacy. No. She's worried about the settlements because if Israel was to go too far with them, it might leave them with no other option but to annex all of Palestine, which would then mean that all Palestinians would be under official, rather than just the current unofficial, Israeli control, which would dilute the racial majority that she wants to maintain, and which would also apparently force Israel to do apartheid to them. Because otherwise it would just become another Arab country without Western values. Her words. Just about the clearest dog whistles imaginable. The tragedy of this wouldn't be the full conquest and dissolution of all of Palestine. No. It would be the dilution of the blood quantum and westernness of Israel. Also note the clear racism there of considering all Arabic-speaking people the same. She treats all of them like a homogeneous blob, so to her a Palestinian majority Palestine would just be another Arab state apparently. Same as all the others. It almost seems like these lines are just tailor-made to tug at the heartstrings of Western racists. Don't you want us to remain as a beacon of the West? You wouldn't want us to become just another Arab state, right? It's the definition of saying the quiet part out loud. It's utterly baffling that she can say this, and then just have supposedly leftist streamers not only act all buddy-buddy with her, but defend her for it. She additionally made the claim there that removing Israeli settlers in the West Bank would be a human rights disaster. She said the same thing in even more emphatic terms beforehand when she characterized the 2005 removal of Israeli settlers from Gaza by the Israeli government itself, by the way, as an ethnic cleansing of Jews.
But the consequence of pulling out of Gaza and giving it back to the Palestinians was ethnically cleansing the region of Jews from Gaza. They literally kicked out all the Jews.
This is just completely untrue. An ethnic cleansing or human rights disaster is not when illegally implanted settlers are removed from occupied territory, and especially not when they're removed by their own government and then given houses in Israel proper in Arab majority areas so that they can contribute to the Judaization campaign there, as happened after the Gaza withdrawal. It is, in fact, a war crime to implant settlers into occupied territory, and the West Bank is unambiguously acknowledged as being illegally occupied worldwide, including by most of Israel's own allies. A 2013 UN Human Rights Inquiry concluded that removing Israeli settlers in the West Bank would not be any sort of crime or human rights violation because their presence there is actually a war crime. So them not being removed is actually the crime and human rights violation here. There's obviously no human rights disaster when no human rights are being violated. The settlers are, in fact, violating the rights of Palestinians. This is clearly an intentional reframing of the situation to paint the Israelis as victims rather than aggressors and oppressors. It's designed to make it sound like taking measures to end an illegal occupation and its war crimes would actually be some sort of racially motivated anti-Semitic pogrom. This is no less ridiculous than it would have been to accuse Native Americans of anti-white ethnic cleansing for wanting American settlers to stop occupying their land. This dishonest framing also has plenty of precedent. The aforementioned Israel Project guidebook also contained this exact same argument, stating that the best pro-settlement argument is to frame stopping and removing illegal settlements as a kind of ethnic cleansing of Jews. Not just them either. Have you ever heard of Benjamin Netanyahu, the far-right former Israeli Prime Minister? Well, he frequently uses this talking point to argue for maintaining and expanding settlements. This is the kind of company that Aristocracy is in here. All of these dishonest actors rely on leaving out the part where these settlers are illegally implanted on stolen, militarily occupied land as key parts of the expansion of the Israeli project of settler colonialism. Israel and its supporters play these sorts of word games all the time, and they often work very well to shut down dissent. The point of this tactic is to prevent people from describing Israel, its crimes, and potential remedies to said crimes in accurate terms, by changing something like the removal of illegal Israeli settlers complicit in war crimes from the occupied West Bank to just an ethnic cleansing of Jews. This evokes images of historical anti-Semitism, making the settlers seem like poor innocent victims rather than the living, breathing war crimes that they actually are, who are actively victimizing Palestinians. And just like that, anyone who supports the eviction of illegal West Bank settlers can magically be smeared as an anti-Semite, and others who witness it are scared into silence lest it happen to them too. Aristocracy's use of this tactic here is just one example of it. It's incredibly pervasive throughout discourse on the subject, and it's used constantly by very powerful people, organizations, and the Israeli government itself. Absolutely everything is done to reframe Israel and those complicit in its crimes as simple victims. Even people who support Palestine often fall for this sort of thing, so watch out for it. I'll be making a standalone video explaining this in more depth eventually, because it's clearly badly needed. Now, let's address the subject of Israel supposedly not yet doing apartheid. This will take a while. There are 3 different branches of the apartheid that Israel imposes on Palestinians. That in Israel proper, the one in Gaza, and the one in the West Bank. In Israel itself, Palestinians are second-class citizens, discriminated against across all facets of society, both officially and unofficially. Israel is very open about this, it's really not anything controversial. Only to foreign audiences do they use the "but we're a democracy and we let them vote" line. In Israel itself, everything is discussed much more frankly. Not only has their government openly declared the country to specifically be a Jewish ethno-state in law, but the courts have even refused to acknowledge a non-ethnic Israeli identity as a thing because, I quote, "it would undermine Israel's Jewishness." Whatever little ability Palestinians have to meaningfully participate in the political system is massively hampered by many laws. Their participation is only allowed so that they can be presented to the world as tokens, so that Israel can say, "Look, we don't have apartheid. Some Palestinians are in parliament." Under Israeli law, in force since 1958, it is illegal for any political party to challenge the status of Israel as a Jewish ethno-state, even indirectly. So it's illegal for Palestinians to advocate to de-racialize the state. Supporting Palestinian armed struggle or associating with any group deemed terrorist by Israel, which is whichever Palestinian groups they feel like, including, for example, random Palestinian NGOs, is also illegal, which makes it impossible for Palestinians in Israel to politically organize with those in Gaza or the West Bank without being arrested. The effect of these laws can clearly be seen in the fact that the supposedly equal Arab representatives in the Knesset are either little more than the tiny, angry voices of a powerless minority, or token collaborators, who couldn't even openly oppose Israeli colonialism even if they wanted to. Imagine if the USA had laws saying that it was a white state, that trying to change that was illegal, and the Supreme Court ruled that the country was based around whiteness. It's the exact same thing, no less horrid. To claim that Israel isn't carrying out apartheid and being incredibly open about it is already ludicrous. But there's more. There's the aforementioned ethnicity-based immigration policy, where Jews from anywhere are free to come and live in the country whenever they please, being granted full citizenship and paid subsidies and everything, while Palestinians ethnically cleansed from their homes are denied the right to even visit because apparently they're of the wrong race. This is the result of twin laws from 1950, still in force today. The law of return grants every Jewish person in the world the right to Israeli citizenship, while the absentee property law defines any empty Palestinian property, of which there were a lot, since Israel had just got done murdering and expelling hundreds of thousands of people, as being abandoned, and thus free to be confiscated for use by Jewish people. Jews who returned to Israel, a place they'd never been to, were invited to occupy Palestinian homes and land, just as how Nazi settlers had been invited to occupy Polish and Jewish land 10 years earlier. Palestinians lucky enough to have remained with the right to be second-class citizens in Israel watch as the state actively tries to erase them from visible existence. It does this by encouraging those it considers to be racially pure Jews to colonize the few still remaining Palestinian majority areas in the country, the aforementioned Judaization process. Often, Jews are moved straight into stolen Palestinian houses, which the Israeli government is constantly concocting whatever bullshit reason it can muster to steal. There are currently at least 65 laws that either directly or indirectly favor Jews over Palestinians, and that's just what's on the books. They even make interracial marriage near impossible, just like the US used to do. Marrying a Palestinian non-citizen is flat out illegal in Israel, because the government is just open about wanting to keep as many of them out as possible. No form of civil marriage exists either, so inter-ethnic marriage even between Palestinian citizens of Israel and Jewish Israelis is nearly impossible. A Palestinian cannot even convert to Judaism so they can get a religious marriage, because Israel's conversion authority explicitly excludes Palestinians from eligibility on an ethnic basis. And I mean, even if it didn't, no rabbi would marry them anyway. So the lack of non-religious marriage is actually a means of enforcing a ban on interracial marriage. It's really completely mind-boggling that anyone could have the audacity to claim that a state with its very basis in such brazenly open race-based population replacement, codified directly into law, that frequently openly boasts of its status as an ethno-state, is not an apartheid state. And what about the extra-legal apartheid? It's everywhere too, though obviously it's harder to point to since it's not so simply written into law. They are treated as internal enemies, both by the state and its supposedly racially pure citizens. Profiled by police, arbitrarily arrested and denied bail, etc., similar to the policing of black people in the USA. Palestinians are routinely subject to random arrests, especially if they or anyone in their family has ever said a single word about Palestinian liberation. Simply showing their flag or shouting a pro-Palestinian slogan gets them instantly arrested. Policing is highly racialized, with cops being enforcers of the interests of the Jewish population over Palestinians. Any protest or event organized by Palestinians is likely to be broken up by police, while Israelis chanting racist slogans and calling for the deaths of all Palestinians are protected by them. Their communications are closely monitored for any political activity. I myself know Palestinian second-class citizens of Israel who have been arrested too many times to count for things like having a politically active cousin, or saying bad things about Israel online. Good luck finding someone to rent you an apartment outside of Arab majority areas if you're Palestinian, because the country is very intentionally segregated along ethnic lines. Jewish majority landlords are 2.4 times more likely to respond to inquiries from Jews than they are Palestinians. Good luck getting a job, since studies have shown that Jewish applicants are 4 times more likely to get an interview than Palestinians. The effect of this intentionally designed system of racial oppression is clear from Palestinian average income being half that of Jews, as I cited earlier. They are oppressed for the benefit of the Jewish people that the state deems to be of the correct race, the same arrangement as that of South African apartheid. And if it's that bad in Israel, imagine how much worse the West Bank is. The West Bank is under Israeli military rule, regardless of how people like Eristocracy like to say that it's actually ruled by Palestinians. It is occupied by Israeli troops who impose the will of Israel, the ultimate authority over the entire territory, and its laughable Palestinian government, completely at the mercy of Israel, can scarcely do more than just be their puppet at this point. IDF troops provide cover for Israeli settlers who encroach on more and more of the West Bank every day. West Bank Palestinians live under a 24/7 military occupation, where any of their rights, and I mean any, to their homes, to their personal property, to their life, can be violated at any second arbitrarily, because they really just don't have any at all. They live under military law. Palestinian civilians there are policed by the Israeli military and tried before Israeli military courts. Meanwhile, the Israelis colonizing the West Bank enjoy 24/7 protection, and the full force of the Israeli government coddling them every second of every day. There are military checkpoints everywhere that Israelis are waved through, while Palestinians are, of course, stopped, grilled, and abused. Israel proper is an apartheid state, but that word becomes inadequate when describing the West Bank, which is clearly something even worse. It's a holding zone for people that Israel is hoping to eventually get rid of. And what about Gaza? Gaza is a concentration camp. A reservation, a place where people considered less than human by the Israeli state are confined in horrid conditions, completely at the mercy of Israel. Without Israel's permission, no one gets in or out. Without Israel's permission, nothing gets in or out. It is a Bantustan, which was one of the core parts of the South African apartheid system, a small bit of land where black non-citizens were confined by the apartheid state. Israel's pervasive control over the very basics of life, even getting into the tiny Gaza Strip, makes it the worst expression of all of Israeli apartheid, and that's saying a lot. Even the conservative former PM of the UK, David Cameron, usually a committed Zionist, admitted that it was an open-air prison, that Gazans managed to survive and carry on, despite Israel taking every means possible to starve them out and make their lives impossible, can only be considered an absolute miracle. Israel is already one state. All of Palestine is subject to it as the ultimate authority. To deny that all Palestinians live under at least apartheid is to lie. It is to deny the oppression that they experience every single day in service of whitewashing the true reality of what Israel is. It is intentionally malicious, racist propaganda, no less absurd than it would have been for a white South African to say that apartheid there didn't exist. Israel, in fact, expertly replicates the same structures that characterized apartheid South Africa. Even the usually tepid liberal organization Amnesty International recently had to admit that Israel is at least guilty of apartheid, which should be a good indication that the label shouldn't be remotely controversial at all, and even that it's inadequate. Because it is. The Palestinian situation is worse than just apartheid, and the term does not adequately encompass their plight by itself. It is apartheid, but it's also much more. Okay, there. Finally. We're done going over the worst parts of a video. So everything that I just went over was pretty much the same as what I said in my initial response to Aristocracy's video, though obviously not in anywhere near this much detail, rather just in an off-the-cuff stream clip on my second channel. I have all of my responses to her linked below in the description if you want to confirm this. I have nothing to hide, she has everything to hide. So this is very clearly a political disagreement. I've been doing little more than responding to her stated political positions all through this dispute, and what I just went over is pretty much what I've been saying the whole time. The idea that I'm attacking her because she says she's Jewish is completely baseless, and you won't find anything in any of my responses to her even remotely indicating that. Nor could she, which is why she's just been completely unable to point to anything specific that I've said. She's just completely insisted that she's gotten anti-Semitic vibes from the fact that I dared to point out and respond to her own statements. Unfortunately, her original stream VOD is gone, but here's a short excerpt of my reaction to her making these allegations for the first time in December of last year. I was really just floored by the ridiculousnly of it.
We weren't debating Israeli politics. Bad Empanada was being an anti-Semite.
I love to see her explain that one. Let's go.
Like, that's what was going down there. He was being an anti-Semite. He was regularly using dog whistles against me.
Such as?
He regularly would bring up Holocaust analogies.
Oh, bring up a Holocaust analogy. Bring up a comparison to the world's most well-known settler colonial project. How dare you do that? It's anti-Semitic in of itself. Dog whistles? None listed. Where's the dog whistle? Where is it? Her one thing apparently is that I made Holocaust comparisons. Is that it? In the modern day, there is nothing existing in the world that is as close to Nazism as Israel is. Fact.
To use against me constantly as a way to get to me?
As a way to get to you. No, it's called a fucking argument. As a way to get to you. Like, she's like an emotional wreck, man. Everything that she's like is just like, this hurt my feelings. Like, an analogy isn't an attack on you. An analogy is an attack on your argument. An analogy is a counter-argument. Unbelievable.
And he just kind of like, and people just kind of treated it, a lot of small streamers just treat it like, oh, it's just, they're just...
She's like on the brink of fucking crying. God, this is incredible.
Debating Israel. There was no debating Israel. Like, there just wasn't.
You notice how she never refers to anything that I ever say? Baseless assertions every single time. It's just a cry. It's a fucking crybaby. It's just literal, like someone who just like cries and tries to elicit sympathy from her audience without being able to make any sort of coherent counter argument to deal with anything at all. A straight up crybaby.
I was only going to be an okay Jew with him if I was okay with wiping all Jews off of the earth.
What? That is another mask off moment right there. She's equating being against an Israeli ethno-state with wanting to wipe all Jews off the earth. That's what she said there, explicitly. So she's trying to frame me as an anti-Semite because I'm against an Israeli ethno-state, an Israeli settler colonial ethno-state that is currently doing genocide. I'm against that, so ergo, I'm an anti-Semite. That is her logic.
That's called anti-Semitism.
She's such a stereotype. The stereotypical, like, Israeli who, like, the first fucking instance of dealing with an argument or facts that they don't know how to react to, you're an anti-Semite. Weaponize anti-Semitism. I have a fucking video on that, specifically regarding Israel. It's so predictable. Weaponize anti-Semitism allegations. Israel's favorite tactic. There you go. I made that months ago, 6 months ago, before I even knew who this person was.
If the
Feels
only
like he
way
supports
as a
the
black person
Holocaust.
you're going to be
It does.
accepted into, like, as being, like, you know, as being a part of human society, you have to say that you, like, hate all other black people and you want all black people wiped off the earth. And, like, yeah, that's pretty fucking racist.
This is absolutely fucking insane. She's trying to say that I said, like, according to her, I said that I want all Jews wiped off the face of the earth. Could we get a citation for that, please? Could we please get a citation for that?
So, yeah. That shit is really fucking annoying.
Like,
I was completely
She's just concluding? She's proven nothing. She's proven nothing and she's already concluding. What's going on here?
shocked by, like, there's some streamers that I've raided into streamers that I thought we were...
Oh, what? You've raided them, so that means I need to support settler colonialism and your ethnostatism, I guess. Like, it's all clout. This is what I mean. For these people, it's all clout. It's all about, like, hugbox, friend group stuff. I even raided these small streamers, so they're apparently obligated to run cover for me when I'm straight up bullshitting and lying about my own opinions on how Israel should be an ethno-state. Her whole thing here is just fucking outrage at the fact that she's being correctly called out, and she thinks that, like, vaguely being people's acquaintances means that she should be immune to it.
Everything was fine. And they were, like, you know, being like, oh, like, she's really sus. And they participated in anti-Semitic dog whistles. And at first I
Like what? Like what? Tell us which anti-Semitic dog
kept
whistles.
denying it to myself because, like, I almost would prefer. I would prefer if we were just, like, this was just about having an issue with, like, an Israel take or something. But the fact that my views are so fucking far left, like, when it...
Your views are not far left at all. There is absolutely nothing far left about her. What the fuck is she talking about, man? I am so confused. Yup. Her response has amounted to little more than that over and over. To her, critiquing her political views is anti-Semitism and harassment. You're a public figure talking about politics. It's not harassment to respond to you. And I mean, you're also a completely anonymous anime VTuber. It's like a ventriloquist complaining that people are harassing their dummy and falsely accusing them of anti-Semitism in response. So not only is she just straight up lying about me, but it's also just so wildly disproportionate. My anime avatar has been attacked for its political views. Time to drop a nuke in response. Since figuring out the power of this strategy of screaming anti-Semitism while playing the helpless victim, she's only escalated it more and more since. She's repeatedly tried to get me banned on the basis of this supposed anti-Semitic harassment, with tons of people, of course, uncritically boosting her without needing to see a shred of evidence for her claims. I think the best one that really emphasizes the pure ridiculousness of her false anti-Semitism allegations was this tweet. This is what I get for existing as a Jewish creator. All these quotes are either lies or taken out of context, where I was quoting other perspectives from my own. Now he admits to evading my blocks in order to harass me. At YouTube. Why is this anti-Semite not banned? Link below. And the attached image is literally just me quoting her. Me paraphrasing the same thing she factually said that we just went over. The problem, clearly, is not that she said some abhorrent things and is being criticized for doing so, it's just that she's existing as a Jewish creator. It's a good example of a few things. False anti-Semitism allegations, public figures having no concept of what harassment actually means, and weaponized false mass reporting campaigns. Now obviously, I'm not going to get banned for quoting her on my YouTube community page, because that's not bannable, it's not anti-Semitic. Obviously, she seems to think that the mere fact that she says it's anti-Semitic while providing no evidence whatsoever is gonna make YouTube think so too. Like, honestly, real I want to speak to the manager energy there. Another great one was when she posted an obviously fake screenshot of me supposedly threatening her. It literally references a fake militant group from a video game, so she almost certainly knew that it was fake, but she posted it anyway. And as of recording this, it's still up, even after she's been told that it's not real by dozens of people. The replies to this are just hilarious too. Here's my favorite one. First Son Alexa seems to be the name of a video game. Might also be a group of people with the same name, but they show no trace on Google. Either way, absolutely terrifying and awful statement. Stay safe. That fake screenshot where you're threatened by a video game militant group? Absolutely terrifying. Stay safe. There's some really bizarre stuff going on here. She was hiding some really awful beliefs behind this image of her as like an ooh-woo cute anime avatar with a soft voice that could do no wrong. And that's apparently such a strong strategy to avoid any accountability that even when someone clearly states that they know that what you're saying is bullshit, that they know the group doesn't actually exist and it's just a video game, they still rush to give you a hug box, send thoughts and prayers, and frame you as some sort of helpless victim and anyone who dares criticize you as a supervillain. We've entered the era of ooh-woo, so cute and harmless anime ethnonationalism, where VTubers tell you in a soft voice that ethnically cleansed Palestinians can't return to their homes because they want to take up space, which could be used to build an extra bedroom for a racially pure Israeli family. I, for one, absolutely hate this. Another funny one is from when someone accused her of faking that screenshot, and her reaction was, "Where's the evidence that I faked it? That I'm Jewish? Could you be any more ridiculous? Seriously, the crocodile tears are absurd." She's constantly trying to frame herself as some sort of innocent victim of anti-Semites because, as a public figure, she's been criticized for her awful, fascistic political views on the internet. Also, a couple of days after posting that, she posted this. A screenshot of an obviously staged raid on her Twitch channel from accounts with anti-Semitic names that just so happened to conveniently reference two people who she's been feuding with. Not just me, but also another streamer who she hates who has a very small channel. Wow, that's definitely a coincidence. With all the slimy shit she's done so far, I have absolutely no doubt that she organized this herself. She's desperate to frame herself as the victim, and what better way to do so than by trying to associate me and someone else who she dislikes with anti-Semites. Though she didn't really do it very competently. Like, seriously, you gotta tone it down a little bit to make it at least somewhat believable. It reminds me of the guy who spray painted Black's Rule on his driveway to pretend he was a victim of anti-white racism. I'm not going to apologize for this because it has absolutely nothing to do with me. It's pretty clearly just someone, likely Aristocracy, and if not her, then someone from her community, trying to attack me. I can tell it's frustrating for them that there's absolutely no actual evidence of my supposed anti-Semitism that they can point to, hence they've taken to just inventing it. Oh, and I want to remind you of something that I showed way earlier in the video too. Her literally accusing me of being wanted for rape. Yep. Her lies aren't just limited to anti-Semitism allegations. She's very, very serious about inventing bullshit about me, and she will make anything up if she thinks it'll help distract from what she said. I'm not going to bore you by going through every single bullshit allegation she's thrown at me, though there have been many more and will likely be even more after this video comes out too, because she really just has no idea how to respond in any other way. I'm pretty confident in predicting that she's going to resort to faking even more screenshots and inventing even more bullshit wholesale, so be advised that whatever she ends up posting, or whatever narrative she tries to spin, will be fake. She's just completely incapable of sticking to the actual politics. After I made her views a bit more widely known, she went into damage control mode, and she's alternated through a few different contradictory excuses for what she said. Excuse number one is that she was clip-chimped, a phrase used by streamers and their fans to imply that it is some sort of heinous crime to quote pretty much anything they say ever. A pretty self-evidently ludicrous idea that isn't applied nearly as liberally to anyone else in any other medium. The claim goes that these segments where she finishes entire paragraphs somehow do not accurately reflect her views because there's some special context that was dishonestly cut out that supposedly changes everything. I highly suggest you watch her original video, which makes it clear that this is not the case at all. The evidence favors me overwhelmingly in every instance, so I'm going to be very open with it and link it all in the description. The notion that anyone speaking for like 20 to 40 seconds straight isn't being accurately represented, unless they're clearly joking or something, is pretty clearly bullshit the vast majority of the time. It really shows how incredibly dishonest streamers and their fans are, that they act like it's somehow wrong to cite someone speaking multiple full sentences, sometimes even a full paragraph or two. And when you go and check the original video, the supposed mitigating context is, of course, never actually there. Both in this instance and in general, it's just a way for them to hand-wave away anything inconvenient that they've said because they know that it's otherwise indefensible. Excuse number two is that the clips were cut together from her saying individual words or phrases to make it sound like she said things she never did. This is the defense that her leftist friends, Vorsh and Lonerbox, also immediately went for when trying to cover for her.
Before or after,
you're
right?
trying to end these are spliced together, right? You're saying that I took different
Yes.
sentence structures and put them together.
Yeah.
No, that's just her microphone having like a mute threshold.
Yeah, it's like a YouTube poop tier editing. Okay, well, it's impossible to know anything about what she means or what she's saying with the cuts being done like this. It's so dishonest.
And she herself said this in Lonerbox's comment section, replying to someone commenting that her audio sounds weird and asking if it was me or her who had made the chops with, "Nah, he made the chops." She and the people covering for her were taking advantage of the fact that her audio is terrible and routinely has weird sounding cutouts because she streams with push to talk, so they use this claim that it was all a hack job crafted from words being spliced together. Except, here's a comment that her editor left on the video 6 months prior. I quote, "The words are cut off sometimes. She uses push to talk, and that can cause the words to end abruptly. Not much I can do." After this was called out, Aristocracy tried to cover her tracks by deleting her comment on Lonerbox's video of my debate with him, where she claimed I had chopped her words, and she deleted the comment from her editor on her original video, where he made it clear that this never happened, as the weird audio cuts were just a built-in part of the original video. Slimy. This defense is a tacit admission that everyone involved knows that what she said there would be completely unacceptable if she really said it. And since she really did say it, like 5 different times in one single video, that's really inconvenient for them, isn't it? Of course, they just won't acknowledge this because they care infinitely more about keeping the human centipede of clout together than they do anything resembling principled and consistent politics. Anyone who's a part of the club must be defended from anyone outside of it at any cost. Her third excuse has been to say that she was actually not speaking for herself at all in that video, but rather just explaining the views of the average Israeli. This is a frankly bizarre claim, because not once in the video does she ever even remotely indicate that she was doing anything like this throughout, but she does constantly signal that she's stating her own opinion by prefacing her statements with clear indicators as such, like, "to me, in my opinion, and I think," you know, as in the clips that I showed earlier. Obviously, I can't just play the entire 90-minute long video here to prove this, so again, if you doubt me, I encourage you to go and watch it in full and look for anything resembling an indication that she wasn't speaking for herself while making these statements. It's simply not there. She in fact indicates the exact opposite dozens of times, including multiple times in the worst clips that I showed here. It's clear bullshit. She recorded herself speaking for 100 minutes, very obviously just stating her own beliefs and opinions as people normally do, and then has the audacity to say, "But I was actually role-playing someone else the entire time without actually indicating it at all," once she realized that it didn't go down well and could potentially damage her image. But her fans are so incredibly stupid that they actually bought this, so she's somehow gotten away with it. It's even stupider when you consider that she's also been saying this alongside the other 2 excuses, which are completely contradictory. He edited it and made me say that, but also, I did say it, it's just someone else's opinion. Apart from the obvious fact that she just was not role-playing as someone else, there are also precedents of her saying the same sorts of things before she released this video, though without saying the quiet part quite as loudly. For example, Here's her in an earlier video of hers.
I am a Zionist if you define Zionism a certain way. But the way, and probably the way I would define it. But if you don't define Zionism the way I define it, then I'm not a Zionist. And I think the majority of people define it in a different way. So I would define Israel, like a Zionist, right? In at least believing that some people from a historically oppressed group, like Jews, in this case, have the right to self-determination in order to feel safe until the point in which that's not a real issue anymore, right? At the same time, while I think that the foundation of Israel was very problematic, the way it was done was really gross. I do think an ethnic cleansing happened in 1948. I think Palestinians deserve reparations. So I believe in those things, right? But I also think that Israel has as much of a right to exist as any other country that was built on problematic foundations. So if you think that Israel having the right to exist safely is being a Zionist, then I'm a Zionist.
That's a more duplicitous, less explicit way of saying the exact same thing. Let me explain, because it might not be immediately obvious. There's a lot of very common tricks at play there that she used to make it sound less bad. So this is a good opportunity to explain the misleading, emotionally manipulative parts of her ideology, liberal Zionism, which often catches people unfamiliar with the issue off guard, since it's ethno-nationalism couched in social justice-sounding rhetoric. You're probably already gaining a bit of an understanding of this yourself from the clips that we watched earlier and my breakdown of them. First, she tries to frame herself as a Zionist, though solely by her own definition, rather than by the one that most people actually use. This is simply false. If you believe in the existence of Israel as a Jewish majority ethno-state, which necessarily comes at the expense of Palestine, you are a Zionist, especially if you're an Israeli yourself who's advocating for that. And that is how most actually conceive of the term. She clearly does, so she's a Zionist. Kind of simple, regardless of how much she tries to complicate it. She constantly does this thing where she tries to frame herself as actually really left-wing, but no. It doesn't matter how nice you think you are, it doesn't matter how many Israelis are even worse than you. If you believe in maintaining an ethnic majority in a settler colonial state based off the ethnic dispossession, expulsion, and oppression of the people who were there before, then you are not even remotely left, not even close. That's a pretty simple principle to stick to, I think. It's as ridiculous as it would be for someone to frame themselves as left if they thought that white South Africans should have been allowed to carve a white majority ethno-state out of half of South Africa. And that's really the crux of this. She acknowledges that the Nakba was ethnic cleansing, though as established earlier, her definition of ethnic cleansing is pretty meaningless, and she laughably repeats the reparations but not return non-solution which we dealt with before. So her solution to the Nakba is basically nothing. She acknowledges that it happened and then is like, well, tough shit, it's Israel's now. And then she still goes on to frame Israel as just being a safe haven for Jews and that it existing is somehow an act of self-determination. To say that stuff immediately after mentioning the Nakba is really ghoulish as fuck. So the Nakba was sad, but in the end, it was an act of Jewish self-determination, and now Israelis can feel safe because there's not as many pesky Palestinians around, I guess. The way that Israelis try to reframe themselves as being the victims is really something. It's obviously true that Jews have been historically oppressed, particularly in Europe, but Israel is not a country that was carved out of Germany, something that would have been very just given what Germany had just recently done to Jews. It was carved out of Palestine at the expense of hundreds of thousands of people who had nothing to do with it. It was also an act that had been planned for many decades prior. The Holocaust was merely an impetus to speed up the process. The 19th century Zionists didn't choose Palestine out of a sense of justice. They chose it because they saw it in the same way that settler colonists all over the world saw the places they'd invaded, as empty land free for the taking, just waiting to be colonized, as if the people who live there already were of no concern whatsoever. It is not self-determination if it's a project of nation building that was planned from the very beginning to come at the expense of the people who were already there, to destroy their society and build your own that you considered superior on top of it, and to exclude them from it. That is domination and supremacy over others. It's similar in essence to the South of the USA declaring independence, which some Southerners even today still laughably frame as having been an act of self-determination. If your supposed self-determination involves slavery and racial dominance, then it's not self-determination. Zionism has never been about living alongside Palestinians as equals. It has always involved dominating, ruling over them, or excluding them as much as possible to secure as ethnically homogeneous as possible of a state at their expense. And that right there is the problem with it. Framing that as self-determination to feel safe is another instance of her inverting the relationship between the oppressor and the oppressed in Palestine, to engender sympathy for the colonizer rather than the colonized. This is another common pro-Israel manipulation, where it's made out as if Israel should get some sort of special pass to do things that would normally be unacceptable because it's a Jewish ethno-state and they're a historically oppressed group. So forming a country by stealing another and ethnically cleansing its people is magically A-OK, as is being obsessed with racial demographics, to the extent that the average white supremacist would think they're being a bit too obvious about it. She also tries to frame Israel as just being another country with problematic foundations, same as all the others apparently, so it should have some ephemeral right to exist despite all of this. This is, again, absurd. Those problematic foundations are the usurpation of most of a country in the name of racial supremacy and the expulsion of most of its people just 74 years ago. Relatively few other countries in the world today have foundations that were quite as bad and quite as recent. Very few other countries today have millions of people they consider subhuman forced into Bantustans or reservations where they're policed 24/7 by murderous soldiers, a situation that is intimately linked to those very recent foundations that she just calls problematic. There are still millions of Palestinian refugees waiting to return to their homeland, and millions more still struggling to one day make it whole once more. To say that Israel has a right to exist as an ethno-state is to say that you think the right of conquest is a good principle to operate on, and that the victims of this should just shut up, give up their land, stay in their reservations, and forget about it. To frame Israel and its foundations as just like any other state is not only just a bold-faced lie, but also a tactic of normalization, whereby Israel is presented as just another country in the so-called community of nations, obfuscating the fact that it really just isn't. Like, sure, the Israeli government might do bad things, but there's nothing inherently wrong with it historically or structurally, like the fact that most of its territory has been stolen, and that it was built on the ashes of another society 74 years ago. What she said in that clip, despite being couched in terms that might sound softer to the unassuming ear, is absolutely the same as what she said in those clips from earlier, that Israel should both retain its conquered land and continue to be an ethno-state, and that's just fine and dandy. Sure, it's sad that Israel has done bad things to Palestinians, but oh well, at most, we should just pay them to fuck off and tell them they're a state now, so they'll stop bothering us. Oh, also, we're too poor to pay them anyway, so I guess they should just get nothing. She also said that, if you forgot. They can't return to their stolen land and homes because they're of the wrong ethnicity, and that would dilute the racial character of Israel and its Western values. You don't want just another Arab state, do you? This is further backed up by this tweet of hers, where she expresses support for Israel being a Jewish ethno-state alongside a Palestinian state, and again reiterates the ridiculous idea that Israel is somehow not committing the crime of apartheid, along with her again repeating her overarching concern regarding illegal settlements. Not so much that stealing even more of Palestine is wrong, but rather that Israel might end up annexing the land where most Palestinians live, and dilute its racial majority in doing so. Let's analyze this in the context of all of her previous statements. The existence of Israel as a free and democratic state depends on having a Palestinian state as its neighbor. What this means below the surface is that the existence of Israel as a majority ethnically Jewish state, run by and for people of the Jewish ethnicity at the expense of those who they stole their land from and racially excluded, depends on having a Palestinian state where Palestinians can be put to ensure they stop fighting back against the Israeli occupation of their country, that they do not dilute the Jewish racial majority, nor force the poor, oppressed Israeli population to do apartheid to them in order to feel safe. So the existence of the racial state of Israel depends on having a place where people of the wrong race can be placed and no longer trouble it. Of course, she never put it into such explicit terms, though she came really close to doing so in the clips that we watched earlier, but the end goal, both in sentiment and outcome, is exactly that. This is a very common reasoning for why many Zionists favor a two-state solution, not out of the goodness of their hearts, but for the sake of the existence of the Israeli ethno-state. So, what might seem like a good and nuanced, reasonable idea to people unfamiliar with the Palestinian cause is actually an explicit call for solidifying the continued existence of a racial state at the expense of people deemed to be of the wrong race. Her concern is not with justice for Palestine and its dispossessed and downtrodden people. It is with ensuring that Israel does not push too far into the remaining Palestinian territory and get itself into a situation where its racial purity might be diluted by having too many Palestinians within its borders. I actually agree with parts of this. The existence of Israel, meaning the racial supremacist Jewish state on stolen land, does depend on having some sort of dumping ground for people who it doesn't consider to be of the correct ethnicity. Except contrary to her clearly stated belief that this is something that is acceptable to maintain, I think, like I'd hope anyone with an ounce of brain matter would, that that's awful, and an excellent reason for why Israel should not exist. If you in any way support the continued division of Palestine on racial lines, if you are against the right of Palestinians to return to their own homes, their own neighborhoods, their own country, then you are a racist. You are anti-Palestinian. You are not a friend of their cause in the slightest, as you simply do not actually support even the most basic facets of it. You are, in fact, a clear opponent of it. There is no nuance to this situation, there is no both sides, and it's a joke that so many people have allowed themselves to be manipulated by this sort of supposedly nuanced Zionist rhetoric without thinking about what it actually means in practice. Ethnonationalism that racially excludes Palestinians from at least half of Palestine. The notion of left-wing Zionism as it pertains to the current day state of Israel is as ridiculous as the notion of left-wing Nazism. There is clear consistency between these earlier statements and her saying it more explicitly in the Vox response video that makes it even more obvious that the ridiculous excuse that she was just role-playing as someone else is a lie. And that was already obvious given that she never signaled anything remotely of the sort, while she signaled dozens of times that she was stating her own opinion. But streamers and their fans love to deny the most obvious things imaginable that they've explicitly said and create these completely untenable narratives all the time to weasel out of admitting to it. So I have to reiterate this like 50 times and go 5,000 times deeper than should ever have been required. They would never even remotely accept an excuse like that if it was about me, but for someone they like, no excuse is too ridiculous. I can guarantee you that despite this highly detailed rebuttal, they're still gonna ignore it and will be responding to this video by insisting that she was actually role-playing as someone else. It's just completely impossible to reason with those sorts of people because they're not here for the actual issues, they're not here for the politics, they're not here for really anything of substance. They're here for these incredibly weird internet personality niche fandoms, and that's it. Their favorite streamers are to them what a K-pop band is to a K-pop fan. Before moving on here, I want to go into a bit more depth about the ideology of so-called liberal or left Zionism, which Aristocracy espouses, to put all of this into much clearer context, because most people don't actually seem to know anything about it, and that's why people like her can get away with this sort of thing among foreign audiences. There are three main political tendencies regarding Palestine and Palestinians in Israel, and anything else is practically non-existent. Note that my use of the political spectrum between right and left here is relative to Israel only. Obviously, all of these positions are actually far right, if not fascist, as racism like this is unacceptable in any remotely left movement. First, there's the far-right Zionists, which are most people's image of what a Zionist is. And while they're certainly the most visible and vocal, that really couldn't be more wrong. They believe that all of Palestine should be conquered and annexed into Israel, and all Palestinians should either be discriminated against, expelled, or killed, though they usually avoid saying that last option out loud. Second, there are right-wing Zionists who think that, while taking all Palestine for Israel would be morally right, actually doing so and expelling or killing Palestinians would be politically impossible due to the international reaction. So for them, annexing too much of Palestine would be bad, and they would be willing to settle for having a racial supremacist Israeli ethno-state alongside some sort of Palestinian state where Palestinians could be contained because, just as Aristocracy said, the existence of Israel depends on it. Third, there are the liberal or left Zionists. They mostly agree with right-wing Zionists. They think that Israel should be a majority Jewish ethno-state, that it should stop expanding because doing so would dilute its racial demographics, that dispossessed Palestinians should be prevented from returning for that reason, and so therefore, the only way to maintain the all-important demographic majority is to have a neighboring Palestinian state, though they don't like to say that bit out loud quite as clearly as their functionally identical right-wing counterparts do. Rather, they prefer to frame it as if only wanting to steal half of Palestine for their exclusive, racial use somehow makes them great allies of the Palestinian cause. Like imagine some Russian nationalists claiming that they were left-wing and pro-Ukrainian because they only want Russia to annex half of Ukraine. It's that ridiculous. They're also very sad about this and won't stop telling you all about it. It's true that Israel must remain majority Jewish at all costs, but we should maybe be a bit more merciful in our victory. Could we at least maybe treat the Palestinians a bit better while we exclude them from their own country? They shouldn't be allowed to return to their land, but perhaps we could give them a little bit of financial compensation? That is liberal or left-wing Zionism, and that is aristocracy. It's like saying you're a left-wing Nazi, a left-wing Jim Crowist, or a left-wing pro-apartheid South African. Just ridiculous. You cannot claim to be against Palestinian oppression when you are in favor of maintaining its cause, which is Israeli settler colonialism. There's no other situation where these sorts of very clear ethno-nationalist positions would be accepted in left circles, or honestly, probably not even centrist ones. And anyone who makes an exception in regards to Israel is either ignorant, malicious, or just doesn't actually care. She can get away with framing herself as some sort of compassionate liberal only because there's a big lack of knowledge of Israeli politics and Zionist narratives among people who don't particularly follow the issue. Liberal Zionists are no friends to Palestinians, regardless of how much they act like they are to foreign audiences who don't know any better. Seriously, she constantly just blatantly lies and says that Palestinians agree with her on things they absolutely do not, and somehow never gets called out on it. For example, she tried to frame as anti-Semitic the phrase "from the river to the sea," which Palestinians use constantly to assert the fact that their country has been invaded and usurped, and they still rightfully claim all of it. And then claim that Palestinians agree with her because they don't use it anymore, which is just completely wrong. The idea that this is a racist phrase is as ridiculous as it would be if a Russian said that it was racist for Ukrainians to say, "Ukraine extends from Zakarpattia to Crimea." It's the oppressor tone policing the oppressed. It's a white South African under apartheid telling a black South African that he's ethnic supremacist. It's also really funny how she continues under this, saying that hearing this phrase is what keeps her away from pro-Palestine protests. Like, she legitimately believes that Palestine and its supporters should have to make their protests a safe space for Zionists. It's absurd, man. How about you just keep staying away from the protests? I think everyone's fine with that. Liberal Zionists mislead foreign audiences like this all the time, framing their ethno-nationalist opinions as actually being the will of the very people who they come at the expense of. And this is why they're actually even more dangerous than right-wing and far-right Zionists. They act like they're on the side of the Palestinians, yet the vast majority of Palestinians would tell you they're the exact opposite. At least other Zionists have the decency of being honest with their intentions and aims. Honestly though, I don't even think Aristocracy understands any of this. I don't think she's duplicitous with her beliefs. I don't think she's slyly trying to smuggle them in or anything. I think she's just actually very stupid, as most political streamers are. So she's genuinely convinced herself that she's some sort of liberal humanist anti-racist, a great ally of the Palestinians, and simply cannot understand what's bad about anything that I've gone over here. So to her, the only possibility is anti-Semitism. She simply can't imagine any other reason why anyone might be against this abhorrent ideology. And by the way, this isn't just your typical baseless internet psychoanalysis, because she's actually said this multiple times. She genuinely believes that she's pro-Palestine. She's convinced herself that she's beyond reproach because she criticizes Israel sometimes, and doesn't get that the problem is that whatever mild criticism she throws at Israel is nothing compared to statements like Palestinians can't be allowed to return to their own homes because that would dilute the Jewish ethnic majority. So the only possible reason that she can imagine that anyone would oppose what she laughably believes to be her pro-Palestinian politics is anti-Semitism. It's crazy that someone with these views can call themselves pro-Palestine constantly, and somehow almost no one realizes how much of a massive lie that is. It shows how little the average creator in the political streamer sphere really knows. The second they deal with a topic that's a little bit more complicated to understand than Democrats good, Republicans bad, they fail completely. Like in this case where they end up accepting without question an anti-Palestinian Israeli ethno-nationalist into their circles and boosted her everywhere as some sort of reasonable voice. I've been mobbed here by these people, pretty much just because I was the first one who heard someone using clear and obvious Zionist ethno-nationalist rhetoric while actually being able to recognize it for what it was and dared to say something about it. All in all, Aristocracy is just not very smart, and that's putting it nicely, and her politics are terrible to boot. That she even has a small viewer base is an excellent example of how it's not about how good you are, rather who you know and whose ass you're willing to kiss. That much was already evident to me from the first clip I ever watched of her, the agonizing Canadian Indigenous people one. Just a masterclass in brainlessness. Okay, now let's move on to the pure drama part. It's all downhill from here. Nothing informative beyond this point. You've been warned. Now, with everything that we've just went over, with everything we've heard Aristocracy say, with all of the context of where she stands in the incredibly diverse Israeli political spectrum of ethno-nationalists who enthusiastically want to kill them all, to ethno-nationalists who would act a bit sad while nonetheless killing them all, I'd like to highlight the opinion of YouTuber Lonabox on Aristocracy in regards to Palestine. Do you think that she deserves your defense?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, she's a great voice on Israel-Palestine, yeah.
Oh, wait. Okay, wait. Is that sarcastic?
Nope. Yeah, she's a great voice on Israel-Palestine, yeah.
There's no room? They can't come there and Israel still remain a majority state?
Yeah, I think it's safe to say that we have very different definitions of what constitutes a good advocate for Palestine, unless he meant that she's a good advocate for Palestinian oppression at the hands of a supposedly superior race. He's an excellent example of how this circle of sycophantic centrists closed ranks around Aristocracy the second that she was threatened. For one, he was one of the people who immediately retweeted her calls to ban me. When I brought that up while talking to him, he first said that bit about her being a great advocate for Palestine. Then when I played the clips that we also watched and dissected earlier, he claimed that they were fake, clearly showing that he knew that they would be totally unacceptable if real. Then, once he realized that I sounded very confident in their veracity and was probably about to back it up, he immediately shifted to another strategy, outright defending her ethno-nationalist positions as cool and good actually, with amazing arguments like Palestinians can never return to Palestine unless you can prove that 2 million Jews from New York can immediately be teleported there right now this instant.
Did she say this is my opinion before that?
Yeah, she did. She said, I think this is my opinion. She said this multiple times. Like, to me, they can't return.
Do you think if like the entire population of New York Jews, nearly 2 million of them, wanted to go to Israel tomorrow, do you think there would be space for that?
And no nuclear power could ever be forced to give up, aside from, apartheid South Africa, which in an incredibly similar situation to what Israel is, was forced to give up.
It's because you don't have an answer.
What are you
It's because you know that getting a nuclear power to abolish itself is not going to happen.
Are you aware that's literally happened?
How?
The USSR.
Okay.
South Africa.
Right.
Like, did you think that was a gotcha? He seemed to believe that these incredible arguments backed up the position he adopted in the moment just for the sake of defending aristocracy, which amounted to little more in substance than, well, it would be nice if anything else were possible, but it's all just Israel's now, so Palestinians should just get over it. A position that would get you in a lot of trouble if you ever said anything of the sort in a room full of Palestinians. So I have no idea how someone can argue for such notions while seriously trying to frame themselves or anyone else as a good advocate on their behalf. It's such an amazing example of how quickly these people will abandon their purported principles to maintain the cohesion of the clout human centipede. Here's how it works. The people up front shit parts of their audience into the mouths of those behind them, and to ensure that the turds keep flowing straight down their throats, those further back obediently ensure that they remain within the bounds of what's acceptable to those ahead of them. Hence, they absolutely must place themselves against anyone who the centipede considers an enemy to avoid sliding anyone further up in its ranks, whose fifth-hand fecal matter they rely on for income and validation. Defending an Israeli ethno-nationalist centipede member who's chummy with those further up in the centipede against someone who they also dislike is therefore clearly much more important than Palestinian liberation. Simply saying, "Oh, I didn't know she was that bad," was never even remotely an option. The centipede would never allow it. But Lonerbox wasn't even close to the worst one. He's just kind of pathetic with his sucking up to bigger creators to the extent that he makes their voice his Twitch subscriber notification. Vorsch, however, the current head of the centipede, definitely takes the cake. As much of an idiot as he is, I still naively expected him to have more than a surface-level understanding of Israel-Palestine by now, considering he's covered it for dozens of hours at least, has denounced Israel with the energy that it deserves to be denounced, has raised money for Palestinian charities, and has himself been the target of false anti-Semitism allegations as a result. For example, he said this once and was banned from Twitch for it.
There's like 4 other countries which want to destroy Israel.
All very validly. Israel is a massive fucking economic and political threat to the countries in that area. You realize that all the nations in the Middle East have every reason to fucking hate Israel, right? Like, you realize the Middle East would be calmer if they succeeded and obliterated Israel, if they nuked it and wiped it off the map. That would lead to a more peaceful Middle East than one that exists right now.
Now, saying that Israel should be nuked is obviously a bit much. He was clearly just getting a bit emotional in the moment. But the sentiment behind that is very understandable. There are few countries in the world that deserve absolutely unequivocal denouncement as much as Israel does. And we need more people who are willing to actually treat it as such. Just maybe without going that far. So, I found it a little bit surprising that despite his history on the matter, he nonetheless ended up being a key instigator in the Israeli ethno-nationalist aristocracy's smear campaign against me. But before we go further into that, I want to highlight something that happened a few months beforehand, which really drives home how willing he is to change or ignore his principles completely on the fly to get at people he dislikes or defend those he likes. During August and September of 2021, Vorsch had a bit of an internet feud with a much smaller YouTuber, Professor Flowers. Flowers, a black woman, made the mistake of discussing the topics of decolonization and black nationalism with someone with absolutely no knowledge of them, who has all the same sorts of anxieties that white nationalists do about minorities supposedly wanting to do white genocide. It's the same sort of ludicrous reframing of who the oppressed group is that aristocracy engages in. So Vorsch, predictably, quickly turned the discussion to a series of gotcha questions, where he tried to frame Flowers as an ethno-nationalist, despite the fact that she was there to explain misconceptions that Vorsch had about what certain concepts meant, rather than to debate, or to talk about her own views on anything. So Vorsch kept bringing up ethno-nationalism and ethno-states. He said they were awful, so anyone in favor of those ideas was a terrible, irredeemable person, just like Hitler. He focused pretty much entirely on this, despite it being something that Flowers had never even mentioned before.
I think a person who says ethnostates are okay is on a much worse level than your average anti-Semite, sexist, racist, transphobe, whatever. Ethnostates are the most destructive creation that has ever been born of man.
Professor Flowers agreed that ethno-states were bad. However, she said that there was important context that made a hypothetical black American one very different to something like Nazi Germany. So while she was against them, she nonetheless said that she understood why massively oppressed people, such as black people in the US, might feel that they would be better off forming their own polity somewhere in its territory, rather than just sticking around and hoping that the USA stops oppressing them. Again, she never even implied that she supported it, just that she understood where they were coming from. This clip from the very end of that debate summarizes this very clearly.
I think that ethno-states are pretty bad altogether.
Okay. I think they're generally probably a bad idea, but I understand if black people want to not be around people who oppress them.
Now, Professor Flowers was just uncontroversially right there. An ethno-state for black people is probably a very bad idea, but the sentiment behind it is completely understandable. You genuinely have to be just totally incapable of feeling empathy, or be a racist or something, if you can't see why a group that was enslaved, and that has been marginalized for centuries ever since on a racial basis by a white supremacist state, might be driven to the point of saying, fuck it. Maybe we'd be better off on our own. The only valid response that white Americans should have to this sort of statement coming from black people there is not, "You're literally Hitler. You want to do white genocide, as Vorsch and his audience had to it." Rather, it should be something like, "While I don't think that this sort of drastic goal is the best way to deal with the problem, I nonetheless understand where you're coming from. It's incredibly awful that our country has beat you down so much that you feel this is your only option. I'll fight to make sure this changes." The few black people who feel this way don't feel this way in a vacuum. They've been driven to this idea because of what has been done to them. And the way to fix it is to stop oppressing them, obviously. Not to scream at them about how they're Nazis.
It's literally trying to have your own self-determination. That's what it is. That's
what
the context
white
of what I'm
nationalists
talking about.
ask for, right there. Self-determination is the dog whistle that they use when talking about ethno-states.
It's very weird to throw this sort of accusations out against someone when we're talking about groups of people who have been and are massively oppressed on a racial basis by the country that they live in, especially when you're someone who is from the dominant racial group of that country. It's saying, we conquered you, we enslaved you, the state set up to benefit us still benefits us and still oppresses you, but if you even so much as say you get why some other people in your oppressed racial group won out for those reasons, it's not the white supremacist state that's to blame for that, it's somehow you. You are just an anti-white racist.
I think that she's unironically racist and very bad faith.
Vorsch and hundreds of thousands of people from his community, along with a bunch of the pathetic creators who make a living off sucking up to him, spent 6 months ruthlessly harassing Professor Flowers for simply saying that she understands this sentiment. She is, according to them, a Nazi who's just like Hitler, pro-genocide, an ethno-nationalist, etc., etc., all for being just objectively, uncontroversially correct. Given everything that we've gone over here, I think you understand where I'm going with this, right? It's pretty obvious.
I think a person who says ethno-states are okay is on a much worse level than your average anti-Semite, sexist, racist, transphobe, whatever.
It makes sense in a world where there are tons of ethnic and national and religious states, right? To at least have one for your own where you're safe, at least for just one country. And I think that that's totally valid.
Flowers, while not agreeing with actually doing so, said that she nonetheless understands the sentiment that might lead some black people to think they'd be better off in a black majority state carved out of the same country that has mercilessly oppressed them for centuries. And as a result, she's been painted as an ethno-nationalist Nazi. Aristocracy, on the other hand, has outright advocated for Israeli ethno-nationalism. And not just as a hypothetical that's literally never going to happen, but as a continuation of an actual, really existing, 70-plus year-long project of settler colonialism, ethno-nationalism, racial domination, and exclusion. And infinitely worse, too. Not a state carved out of, say, Germany, which actually would have made sense and been just, given what Germany had recently done to Jews, but rather one based on the conquest and usurpation of a completely different country at the horrible expense of its population. However, Vorsch, his community, and his circle of sycophants absolutely love her, and just a couple of months after harassing Professor Flowers, Vorsch invited Aristocracy onto his stream to help her clean up her ethno-nationalist image, frame herself as a victim, and attack me for criticizing her. Professor Flowers, a black radical who dares to have an ounce of sympathy for other black people in the USA, seeking to remedy their own oppression without particularly caring about white sensibilities, makes them incredibly uncomfortable. She's talking about racial issues that hit very close to home for Vorsch's overwhelmingly white audience, while Aristocracy, being an actual ethno-nationalist for an oppressor state elsewhere, which is typically envisioned as Western, is perfectly acceptable to them, making it very easy for them to ignore or spin the horrible stuff that she's said. This is racism. The differential treatment between these two make that clear as day. Vorsch, his community, his fans, the pathetic creators who orbit him, they're all racist. The famous Martin Luther King quote about the paternalistic racism of white moderates applies here perfectly. I must confess that over the past few years, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderates. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's greatest stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizens' counselor or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace which is the absence of tension to a positive peace which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time and constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is more bewildering than outright rejection. Flowers had the audacity to not outright denounce black people, thinking about ways to liberate themselves, as imperfect as they were, from their own oppression, without seeking the condescending, disingenuous help of the white moderates, and these white moderates were not very happy about it. Or maybe I'm actually just being too generous here. Maybe more so than solely being racist, Vorsch is actually more motivated by a desire to defend his friends and attack his enemies at all costs, and changes his politics on the fly to whatever's most convenient for that. Either way, the reason that his fans lapped it up is absolutely due to him having cultivated an audience of fragile, racist white kids. Now that we have that important background, it's time that I actually play the worst clip from when he invited Aristocracy onto his stream, after I first responded to her on Israel-Palestine. The source is of course linked in the description.
Have you considered calling him anti-Semitic?
I never want to be that person. I don't know.
Eventually, you might want to be that person. I take great pleasure in calling pseudo-leftists anti-white, you know? Eventually, it actually is the most fun option.
He did say, like, I was watching one of his videos, and he did say some, like, kind of JQ sassy stuff. And the fact that he just totally, like, discounts. He also, like, every time he gives me an analogy to demonstrate how evil I am, it always involves, like, the Holocaust, which feels pretty gross.
Feels like he supports the Holocaust.
Yup, you did hear that right. Vorsch is the one who first suggested to her that she should baselessly accuse me of anti-Semitism, and even suggested that I support the Holocaust for comparing Israel to the Nazis. A completely valid comparison, by the way, because Israel, being a settler colonial state that is explicitly and openly racialist by law, is the closest country currently existing today to Nazi Germany. If Israel doesn't want to be compared to the Nazis, it should stop doing Nazi-like stuff. Pretty simple solution. This stream happened just a couple of weeks before Aristocracy started accusing me of anti-Semitism every 2 seconds. Whether she was gonna do it herself anyway, or was actually taking Vorsh up on his suggestion, I don't know. Though it does seem like he reminded her that it was an option. Either way, it's clear that Vorsh simply couldn't resist the chance to flagrantly lie to get at someone that he dislikes, while helping someone he likes cover up her ethno-nationalist politics and frame herself as a victim of harassment for being criticized on the internet for her clearly stated political views as a public figure. Vorsh, who dislikes me, put an infinitely higher priority on defaming me in any way possible than he did on actually evaluating the political arguments which my dispute with Aristocracy is actually about. Arguments which, logically, he should be on my side on, given how strongly he objected to the sorts of views that she espoused, at least when he invented the idea that a black woman was espousing them.
Ethno-states are the most destructive creation that has ever been born of man.
And I think that that's totally valid.
This is a clear pattern with him and other creators in his orbit. They all care more about maintaining the clout network than anything else. This isn't even remotely the first time it's happened, and it won't be the last. Personally, I'm pretty much the exact opposite. I definitely do delve into this interpersonal garbage way too much, but my focus is still always on the actual politics. If someone was to come to me saying that they were in a dispute with Vorsh, and that they wanted to come on my stream to talk about it, well, I'd probably just laugh at them. But if I was to consider it, I'd first look into the political side of things to make sure of the most important thing, that I'm not running cover for someone who I should actually be disagreeing with, solely in order to attack Vorsh. To me, someone who acts nice and personable, yet who espouses clear as day Israeli ethno-nationalism, is infinitely worse of a person than someone who acts like an asshole, but who advocates for actual justice and liberation for Palestine. Actual political concerns are just infinitely more important than whether someone is chummy with me or not. I've agreed with Vorsh in the past when I thought he's actually been right on something and defended his arguments from others, because regardless of how much I dislike him, that'll always be of absolutely no importance compared to the actual issues. He's so much the opposite though, that he's perfectly happy to ally with an Israeli ethno-nationalist and use the most vile anti-Palestine defamation strategy, weaponized anti-Semitism allegations, to attack me, without him giving her this clear blessing, if not putting the idea into her head, to go hog wild with the slander. None of this would have amounted to anything, and this video wouldn't exist. Her garbage would have been easy to ignore and just make fun of occasionally, if the only audience for it was just her own hug box of idiots. So that it even became a thing that I'm forced to make this video about is entirely due to Vorsh's childish, brainless malice. Now, usually creators in this sphere are afraid to call Vorsh out for one of two reasons. One, he has at his disposal an audience of hundreds of thousands of rabid teenagers that constantly engage in massive targeted harassment and baseless slander of anyone who expresses even mild disapproval of him, often at his incitement.
The more of you are in the replies being like, that's not what's happening right here. Like, this is necessary, okay? Publicly shame her into changing her mind on this.
Most people, understandably, want to avoid that. 2. Doing so can seriously hurt your bottom line and your audience size. Treating Vorsh with anything but the absolute lightest kid's gloves immediately alienates you from hundreds of thousands of potential viewers from his infamously parasocial audience, who care infinitely more about other creators' relationships to Vorsh than they do about the actual substance of their content. It's very easy to grow your own audience by sucking up to him and his audience. It's the human centipede analogy again. There's a whole cottage industry of smaller creators who are little more than his sycophants, who intentionally try to ally themselves with him on nearly everything, avoid any sort of conflict, and tread extremely carefully if they ever actually dare to disagree on anything remotely impactful. They want to get invited onto bigger streams as much as possible to get exposure, and not only is Vorsh one of the biggest, but he has a whole network of others below him they can also latch onto. So sticking as close to him as possible and pretending that he's some sort of serious intellectual is an excellent way to grow your own YouTube channel, get more Twitch viewers, and get more cash flowing into your Patreon page. Even the people who are actually willing to come out and say something meaningfully negative about Vorsh still often feel that they need to pretend to take him seriously, as if he merits any response other than mockery and just jangling your keys in front of him. They especially need to stay away from referencing certain incredibly well-known things about him that, despite having been very public for a long time, few creators dare to even touch, lest it invite them up upon them. Now personally, I don't care about any of that. That's probably already obvious. I've been harassed by them for years, and frankly it's just laughable to me. Most of his fans are just kids who've unfortunately gotten the short end of the stick as far as teenage obsessions go. So they've made defending Vorsh a core part of their identity. I can only hope they'll look back on it 10 years in the future and cringe. And if someone watches a guy who's never read a book in his life aside from maybe a guide to sexual harassment, saying whatever garbage farts into his mind in the moment, and somehow thinks that he's insightful, then it's incredibly unlikely that they'd be interested in, or even be capable of understanding, the sort of content that I make. There's more value in 2 minutes of any one of my videos than there is in every second that he's ever streamed combined. And that's not even me being egotistical at all. It's like saying that you're better at not murdering children than an IDF soldier. Entirely unimpressive. If someone somehow thinks they're learning anything from watching the guy who does, very questionable things with geckos, babble incoherently about something he knows nothing about while playing a video game, watching intently as his 1.5 neurons fail to form a synapse, then they're just not my target audience. I mean, listen to the guy talk. His stupidity is self-explanatory.
Like, if you want to take a look at, like, what happens when good revolutionaries build a country that's bad and hypocritical, look at the American Founding Fathers. The American Founding Fathers, for all the shitty fucking things they did, actually were, like, for the most part, pretty principled intellectuals that fought pretty hard to get certain positions, not the abolition of slavery, but certain political positions fulfilled in their new government, And then America turned out to be shit, so whatever, But then you look at, like, some of these revolutionary groups in Southeast Asia or Latin America or whatever, and a lot of them are barely better than the fascists they're trying to overthrow. And so much of it is this, like, well, they could have been better if it weren't for this or that or whatever. It seems like it's impossible to find any real answers here. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know. We should support, like, lefty politics. We should support things that make the world a better place, like NATO. But I can't really, like, maybe people fear NATO, so that means NATO's bad because they think a certain way about it.
Who the hell watches a guy babbling on like this for like 8 hours a day and is like, this guy knows what he's talking about, this is the guy I should get my political cues from? Seriously, every second of it is always somehow even worse than the last. One of my biggest YouTube regrets is even having acknowledged the existence of him and others like him. They're complete bottom feeders, and I'm an idiot for even having wasted a single second of thought on them. But anyway, even if there could somehow potentially be an overlap between my audience and his, I still would never suck up to some idiot whose entire being is incoherently reframing American exceptionist liberalism as leftist. Some of us actually try to have integrity and at least a little smidgen of consistency. And that's precisely why Vorsh dislikes me, and is happy to invite an actual ethno-nationalist onto his stream to not just slander me, but also to suggest to her specific strategies on how to slander me. The most vile strategy possible, in fact. One used constantly by Israel and its supporters to justify their project of racial supremacy and the oppression of the Palestinian people. What matters is not Palestinian liberation, it's doing absolutely anything to get at someone he dislikes, while rewarding one of his many pathetic ass kisses. But the main reason that he's willing to go this slow, even more so than just the fact that he knows that he can't deal with my political criticisms, or that he doesn't like me, is actually somewhat specific to me. Because I'm willing to go somewhere that even most other people who he's on bad terms with are unwilling to go. So originally at this part in the video, I was going to go over some of the absolutely terrible stuff that Vorsh has done, show the evidence for it directly and stuff like that. But I think that might detract from the point of this video, because for one, well, he's obviously incredibly wrong here in spite of all that. And this video isn't meant to be about how these people are like shitty people in their personal lives or anything like that. I also honestly think putting that stuff in the video would give it a pretty good chance of getting taken down. So instead, I'm going to just compile a list of this stuff and put it in the description. But the main point of showing all that, aside from just getting back at this asshole, is that Vorsh has done and said things that are so incredibly bad, so completely unforgivable, that in most other instances, they would result in the person who said those things and did those things losing their whole fan base and essentially getting deplatformed. And Vorsh and his fan base are really no different. If they saw someone who Vorsh dislikes, and in turn who they dislike, of course, because that's how they operate, saying and doing the same sorts of stuff that he has done, they would do everything possible to deplatform them, feigning outrage as much as possible, and would never let them hear the end of it. Any other celebrity, minor or major, they'd swear them off. Any mention of their name would be met with derision until the end of time. But because internet personality communities are like cults, and the politics ones just aren't any different, whenever they're confronted with the clear as day evidence of what Vaush did, they instead rally around him and defend him as if their life depended on it. Seriously, there are thousands of them who spend like 10 hours a day searching for people saying anything negative about him at all over the internet and replying. There's even entire internet forums that are dedicated to defending him. It's just insane. And of course, it's even more baffling because his content is just terrible. The guy is just so stupid. So, what was more important for Vaush and his community in this instance? Calling out a straight-up open Israeli ethno-nationalist and a clear opponent of Palestinian liberation on completely non-negotiable political issues, immediately after ruthlessly harassing a black woman for months for supposedly having similar views? Or enthusiastically giving her a platform to lie and making common cause with her because you both have a common interest in silencing someone who's not shy about criticizing you and mentioning some very inconvenient facts about you. You already know the answer. There's also just undoubtedly a big element of ignorance to it because I mean we're talking about Vaush here. I'm sure that, despite spending so much time talking about Israel and Palestine, he somehow still has no idea what liberal Zionism is, why it's so awful and insidious, and just buys that the liberal Zionists he happens across are actually cool and great friends of Palestine. With someone like this, stupidity and malice are always a package deal. Anyway, so yeah. That's how I was defamed by a Zionist and how leftist YouTubers helped her do it. I use the term leftist very loosely there, by the way. These people are just the lowest of the low, so this is the last I'll be addressing this. At least until they inevitably end up fabricating something else about me, and I need to make clear that it's fake. I've kept this stupid internet personality drama off my main channel for years, and making even this one single video addressing it is already a massive mistake. I'm a huge idiot for making it. Don't be me. I have much more important things to cover in the future than the personal proclivities of these sorts of painfully stupid politics creators, whose success is really the perfect rebuttal to any notion that meritocracy exists. There are many more topics that I want to cover, all of which will take infinitely more reading, thought, and effort to put together than what those people have put into their entire content library. I'm well aware that the kind of dry, usually very complex, exhaustively sourced, informative videos that I make will never have an especially wide appeal, and that's fine. I'd still rather stick to making this stuff than do the Ben Shapiro response video number 50,321 type content that gets far more consistent views because it's simple and also appeals to the much larger centrist audience. Everyone already knows that Ben Shapiro and PragerU and Lauren Southern or whoever else are bad. There's few things easier than just dealing with generic right-wing talking points and never actually challenging your audience with anything complicated ever that actually meaningfully challenges the neoliberal status quo. So I'll leave that sort of stuff to the specialist. Lonerbox. Especially over the last year and a half, thanks to finally having enough patrons to keep me afloat if I work on each video for more than a month, I've been able to put out some of my best and most complicated videos yet, covering topics that very few others in this sphere have done any justice to, and I only intend for it to keep getting better. Nearly every video that I've made in the last year and a half or so has required me to sift through countless sources, read multiple books in full, and dozens more articles, and somehow figure out a way to condense it all into a coherent, digestible whole that is at least somewhat suited to the video format. It's an enormous challenge every time, one that is incredibly time consuming to boot and that doesn't result in nearly as much of a reward as many other approaches to YouTube do, but I've still been leaning into it further as time goes by, because I can. This leads us to why this will happen again. Because, well, as I said at the very beginning of this video, I'm going to start making videos on Palestine on my main channel, which is inevitably going to result in more of these sorts of allegations, as supporting Palestine always does. This is honestly something I've avoided doing up until now, because I know what happens to people who denounce Israel in the terms that it should be denounced, and who advocate for Palestine on the same terms that actual Palestinians do. Exactly what happened to me here, but on a much bigger scale. But now that I've experienced it for myself, I've seen how laughably impotent and pathetic the false anti-Semitism allegations and those throwing them around are, and I've realized that I shouldn't fear this. I'm lucky enough to be in a position where I'm totally independent. The pro-Israel lobby, it's supporters and its useful idiots can't pressure my employer to fire me or anything by claiming that being against their settler colonial, racial supremacist state is anti-Semitic, like they usually do. I'm in a privileged position where I'm relatively immune to their usual tactics, and I should make use of it. So I will. Thanks Aristocracy, Vorsh, and everyone else for helping me realize this. I'm not going to let Israel's deplorable defenders silence me as they have to countless others. Palestine is right, and we're gonna win. The framing of Israel and Palestine that you generally see is wholly inaccurate in a way that serves to legitimize Israel. It's always presented as a conflict, and not just that, but an age-old religious conflict, etc. That really couldn't be further from the truth, and it's rare to see much movement beyond this inadequate way of understanding the issue. Rarely is it ever even rightfully called colonialism. It's presented as if it just defies all historical precedent, as if the problem is not that Israel stole Palestine, but rather just that they don't treat the defeated Palestinians nicely enough. If only they had the good grace to do their ethnonationalism in just half of Palestine, everything would be fine, right? And really, that type of wholly incorrect framing being so prevalent is exactly why people like Aristocracy can smuggle their anti-Palestinian beliefs in the first place. Israel is a continuation of the tradition of racist European settler colonialism, and I will explain just how in detail in a video in the future. Until then though, I have a bit of an informal video on my second channel that I'm going to link in the description covering the topic, but my main channel one will be a million times better. So here's a list of some of the ideas that I have for topics that I might want to cover. I might cover all of them, some of them, not really sure. But I'll definitely be making the one on the settler colonial history of the so-called conflict, and on understanding the sort of false anti-Semitism allegations that I went over in this video. The others are just ideas at this point, which may or may not eventually be made. And I'll probably have other videos on other topics interspersed in there as well too. We'll see. Anyway, yeah. That's it for the idiotic drama on this channel forever. I made sure that my one drama video was a big one. See ya! Thanks to my patrons for their support, and especially my $25 plus patrons, Jel Cribson, Shub, A Big Mean Cat, Mischief and Fins, Benny G, Brosnan, Darcius B, Evan Carroll, William Tomlinson, Arthur Simac Jones, Jake Chowdoin, Bantam, RoboCommy, and my $10 plus patrons, Melissa Gomez, Aizmalard, Manuel Orantia, George Rosenbaum, Can't Care Less, Zanguzeng, Justin Bailey 77, JG, Deep Sea J, Naomi Starlight, Cab the Bird Ranger, Michael Strauss, Carlos Dominguez, XXXX, Adam Heitzman, Uminia Kresneti, Average is Awesome, Insurgente, Yugopnik, Naomi Starlight, Mimushin, and Nibiru. Thank you very much for watching, though you should regret it honestly. You really shouldn't have watched this. Why are you even seeing this? You should have X'd out a long time ago. See you next time.